November 21st, 1860. Tom Horn is born in a plain farmhouse in Scotland County, Missouri. While cold air seeps through loose boards and his father, also named Thomas, looks at the newborn as another worker for the rough land outside. The farm lies in thin timber and patchy fields, a place where every day is shaped by chores rather than affection, and where survival depends on hard labor and a will to endure. From the first months of Tom's life, the house carries more tension than warmth. The strap hanging on the wall is as familiar as the family Bible, and both are used to enforce a strict view of obedience. By the time Tom is old enough to remember anything, his world is small. There is the cramped kitchen with its smoke and boiling pots, the yard with its mud and manure, and the fields that reach toward the tree line. His father believes that a boy learns respect through pain. A misplaced tool, a gate not latched, or a slow answer can bring the strap down across his back and legs. The blows are not wild. They are deliberate and sustained, delivered until the older man is satisfied that the lesson has been driven into flesh. Tom learns early to read his father's mood from the set of his jaw and the way his boots strike the floorboards, and to brace himself when that sound changes. His mother, Mary Ann, moves constantly between stove, table, and washtub, trying to keep the family fed and clothed. She tends to Tom's bruises when she can, smoothing salve over raised welts in quick, furtive motions while his father is in the fields or at town. Her voice softens when she speaks to him, but it never rises in open challenge to the man who rules the house. She has many children to care for and no real power to alter the way discipline is carried out. For Tom, her quiet sympathy is a thin barrier against the resentment that builds with each beating. It keeps him from shutting down entirely, yet it cannot change what he knows. In that house, the one who inflicts pain controls everything. Work presses on him from the moment he can stand. As a small boy, he carries water, feeds poultry, collects kindling, and runs messages between barn and house. As he grows, his tasks shift to heavier labor. He helps behind the plow, pitches hay, and moves livestock from one pasture to another. The days begin before sunrise and end after dark, with only brief pauses to swallow food. Conversation at the table rarely leaves the subjects of weather, crops, and religious warnings against disobedience. There is no talk of what he might want from his own life. His value is measured in how much work he completes and how often he stays ahead of his father's temper. The land beyond the plowed ground gives Tom his first sense of control. When his chores allow, he slips away toward the brush and low timber that border the fields. He walks along creek banks, watching how water cuts channels through the soil and how animal tracks press into mud and then fade. As time passes, he studies the shape of hoof and paw marks, noticing which are sharp-edged and fresh and which have softened at the corners. He crouches in thickets and tries to hold still until birds and small animals forget he is there. He learns to move without snapping twigs, to see the difference between a branch that bent under its own weight and one that was pushed aside by something passing. These escapes turn him into a boy who can read the ground and the air for signs others overlook, and the gap between his harsh home life and the watchful quiet of the timber grows wider with every season. In this rough childhood, Tom's closest companion is a dog named Shedrick. The animal is big-boned, strong enough to pull a small cart and smart enough to follow hand signals. Tom teaches him to heel at a gesture, to range ahead on trails, and to lie flat when told. Shedrick follows him to the creek, waits while he studies tracks, and trots beside him when he hides behind sheds to avoid his father. At night, the dog lies near the house, ready to bark at strangers on the lane. For Tom, Shedrick is the only consistent source of loyalty in a place that otherwise runs on fear and duty. The dog's value to the family is plain. Hitched to a light cart, he helps haul wood and feed. He sounds the alarm when riders or wagons approach. Even Thomas Sr. admits that the animal is useful, though he dislikes seeing his son spend more time roaming with a dog than working in the rows. Each time Tom disappears into the timber with Shedrick at his heels, that dislike grows. The older man believes that affection for animals is a distraction from obedience. Tom sees it differently. With the dog beside him, the world feels less hostile, and he is reminded that not every relationship has to be ruled by pain. As Tom enters his early teens, his body changes, and so does the way he responds to authority. He is taller, his shoulders thicker from years of work. He is trusted with a rifle to protect crops and bring in small game. Ammunition costs money, so each shot matters. He sets bottles and bits of scrap metal on posts and practices until he can hit them from distances that impress even his brothers. Out in the woods, he turns that skill on rabbits and birds, bringing home meat that his father grudgingly approves. The rifle gives him something his father cannot reach, a sense that his own hands can decide outcomes that have nothing to do with the strap on the wall. The event that marks him deepest in these years comes on an ordinary day near the lane that leads past the farm. Tom is outside with Shedrick when a wagon rattles up the road, its bed stacked with household goods and farm tools belonging to a family passing through. Older boys on the wagon look down at the farm dog and the thin local boy with hard eyes. Shedrick barks and trots closer, doing what he has always done when strangers appear. The boys taunt Tom and call the dog names. He snaps back, angry and unwilling to back away on his own property. The exchange lasts only seconds before one of the travelers reaches into the wagon for a shotgun. Without much warning, the man swings the barrel toward Shedrick and pulls the trigger. The blast rips through the air. Shot tears into the dog at close range, dropping him into the dust with a sound that grips Tom's chest. Blood pours into the ruts of the lane. The wagon team snorts and dances against their traces while the smoke drifts away. The travelers claim they had to protect themselves from a vicious dog, then cluck to the horses and set the wagon in motion again. No one climbs down to help. No one offers to make amends. In their eyes, the matter is over as soon as the animal stops moving. Tom kneels beside the dying dog, hands shaking as he touches the familiar fur now slick with blood. Shedrick gasps once and then lies still. The boy lifts the heavy body into his arms, staggering slightly under the weight, and turns back toward the yard. His shirt and trousers soak with blood as he walks. His father and brothers see him coming. They understand what has happened, yet they do not go after the wagon or call out demands for justice. To them, a dog killed on the road is one more hard fact of life. For Tom, it is a clear message that strength in this world belongs to those who act and ride away, while the powerless clean up what is left. He digs the grave himself in a corner near the fence, driving the shovel into the ground again and again until blisters rise on his palms. He lowers Shedrick into the hole, covers the body, and stands staring at the raw mound of earth until his legs ache. The farm soon moves on. Chores still need to be done, and the strap is still ready for the next offense. Yet something fundamental has shifted inside him. The loss strips away one of the last restraints on his growing anger. He remembers that no authority figure stepped in to defend what mattered to him. The only thing he could control was how he carried the weight of that loss, and from that day forward he carries it in silence. After the shooting, Tom becomes more guarded. He speaks less at the table and spends more time watching the people around him. He notes how his father uses fear to keep the household in line and how neighbors accept that as normal. He connects the crack of the shotgun that killed Shedrick with the sharp snap of the strap on his own skin. The pattern is simple. Those who can hurt others without consequence shape events. Those who cannot are expected to endure and stay quiet. Tom does not yet have the power to change this balance, but he does have the ability to remember. and to keep sharpening the skills that might someday let him act rather than submit. The breaking point with his father comes when Tom is in his mid-teens. On a day like many others, his father orders him to stop the task he is doing and take up another job in the fields. The command is sharp and impatient. Tom, sore from work and full of buried resentment, answers that he will finish what he started first. The words are not loud, but they carry a tone his father has never tolerated. In an instant, the older man closes the distance between them and hits him, not with the strap, but with his fists. The beating is fast and punishing. Tom swings back, but he is still a boy against a grown man hardened by years of labor. He goes down in the dirt under a rain of blows that leave his ribs aching and his vision blurred. When it is over, he does not return to the house. He staggers to the barn and collapses on a pile of straw, fighting for breath. Pain radiates from his chest and shoulders. Each inhale feels sharp and unsteady. In that dim space, among the smells of hay and animals, he understands that nothing he does will ever be enough to satisfy his father. More work will not buy respect. More obedience will not stop the violence. If he stays, his future will be a line of days like this one, stretching toward an old age he may never reach. He understands more clearly than ever that nothing will change if he stays. In the days that follow, he moves slowly, letting his body heal while his mind turns over the options he has left. He knows there is a road that runs past the farm, a road that carries wagons and riders toward towns he has heard named in passing. He has listened to men talk in churchyards about work on stage lines and in distant territories where cattle and soldiers need tough hands. He has no money, few belongings, and no letters of introduction. What he does have are the hard skills learned from fields and timber. He can endure long days on his feet. He can read ground and weather. He can handle stock and equipment. He can use a rifle with precision. The more he thinks about it, the more obvious it becomes that these abilities will be wasted if he spends the rest of his life under his father's fists. When he finally decides to leave, the preparation is simple. He selects a decent pair of boots, a coat that will keep off some of the wind, and a hat that shades his eyes. He waits for a morning when his father is slow to rise. Before full light, he steps into the kitchen where his mother is already at the stove. She looks at his face and understands. He tells her in plain words that he is going. There is no long speech and no demand for her blessing. She reaches up and touches his cheek, then his shoulder, tears bright in her eyes. She whispers that he should be careful. She does not call out to stop him. They both know what staying would mean. Outside, the yard is quiet in the gray light. Frost clings to the ground and a thin mist hangs over the lower spots in the fields. The animals shift in their pens, waiting for feed. Tom pauses beside the small mound where Shedrick is buried. The dirt has settled, but he can still see the slight rise. That spot ties together his memories of the dog, the travelers who killed him without consequence, and the long list of beatings that followed. It is the last reminder of why he no longer owes anything to the place behind him. He gives the grave a final look, then turns toward the lane. He walks down the rutted track to the road, carrying nothing he cannot bear on his own back. Each step carries him farther from the house, the strap, and the man who used both. He does not know exactly where he will stop. He knows only that he will head west, toward towns and posts where men like him are said to find work. The lessons of his childhood travel with him. That people in power use pain to control others. That close attention to the world can give him small advantages when he needs them. And that no one else will fight for what he values. Before the sun is fully clear of the horizon, the Horn farm has already begun another day without him. The boy walking away along the Missouri road has no way to foresee how his skill with tracking and the rifle will one day make his name feared across the West, or how those same choices will end with a rope around his neck in a distant city. The Missouri road that carries Tom away from the farm bends toward towns he has only heard named in passing. And each mile widens the distance between him and the house where fear was the main rule. He walks until his feet blister, then catches rides when he can, working for meals and a place on a wagon bed. Fences thin out, fields give way to open country, and the sound of his father's voice fades behind the clatter of wheels and the calls of freighters. The first real stop that holds him is Newton, Kansas, a rail and cattle point where tracks, stock, and people crowd into a tight, restless space. In Newton, his world shifts from a family farm to a shared business. His father and older brother take on a livery stable, and Tom works under the same roof as the man he fled, but on different terms. The town paper will later record the horn stable as a local fact, proof that they were not just passing through. The stalls stay full of saddle horses and teams that belong to drovers, drummers, and railroad men. Tom spends long hours currying sweat-crusted hides, cleaning harness, and leading animals between street and stable. He sleeps in lofts or in a corner of the office, waking when night customers pound on the door and demand fresh teams. The work is filthy and constant, yet the beatings that once marked every misstep at home are now rare, checked by the need to keep customers from hearing family violence through thin walls. Newton is not a quiet county crossroads. Trains pull in with a shriek of brakes and a roll of smoke that settles over the yards. Saloons and dance halls line streets near the tracks, their doors swinging well into the night as drovers spend trail pay. Men with pistols on their hips argue over cards, cattle weights, and women. Town ordinances are supposed to govern how firearms are carried, but enforcement depends on the nerve of whoever wears the badge that week. Stories about earlier rail yard gunfights still circulate in bar rooms, and the memory of blood shed on the streets hangs over the place. Tom hears those stories while he holds a lantern for a customer or checks a horse's legs, absorbing the simple lesson that formal laws matter less than the willingness to act when tempers rise. His work in Newton soon blends into jobs along the wider cattle and rail network. As a strong teenager used to long days, he is hired onto trail outfits pushing herds north toward Dodge City. The exact dates and routes will later be traced from news mentions and family recollections. But for the boy in the saddle, the trips are measured in dust, sore muscles, and the long stare of night guard. He rides the edge of herds under starlight, listening for the first signs of a stir that could turn into a stampede. He learns how lightning can spook cattle into a panicked run, and how a single rider in the wrong place can make a bad situation worse. On dry stretches, he scans the horizon for windmills or half-dug waterholes, knowing that a mistake about distance can kill stock and men alike. Dodge City at the end of the trail is a shock of noise and light after weeks of open country. The air reeks of manure, smoke, and spilled liquor. Corrals stretch along the edges of town where buyers and inspectors move down lines of lean, trail-worn animals. Inside town, gambling rooms and saloons roar with arguments in several languages. Marshals and deputies patrol with the authority of city ordinances behind them. Yet their main leverage is still a gun at the hip and the willingness to use it. Tom sees that even where law is written into town charters, its real weight rests in the hands of armed men who are paid to decide when force is acceptable. He brings that observation back to Kansas along with his wages, filing it beside the memories of punishments at home and the shotgun blast that killed his dog. In the winter of 1879, pain in his throat forces him to slow down. An infection that has lingered for months grows worse, making swallowing and sleep difficult. He returns to Missouri for the first time since leaving, not to reconcile with his father, but to see a doctor who can cut out the source of the trouble. On Christmas Eve, a country physician uses the tools and methods of the day to remove Tom's infected tonsils. The operation is crude by any later standard. There is no real anesthesia beyond strong drink and a firm grip. Bleeding, choking, and shock are risks every patient faces. Tom endures it because he wants to be fit for work again, not because he expects comfort. Once his throat heals and he can speak and eat without pain, he has no intention of sliding back into the life he left. He heads west again, drawn not by any romantic picture of the frontier, but by the knowledge that he can trade strength and nerve for wages in places where no one cares about his past. By 1880, his path takes him into the Colorado high country around Leadville and Cripple Creek. These are boom towns built around mines that claw silver and other ore from steep ground. Streets run between rough board buildings, their fronts painted with the names of saloons, assay offices, and supply houses. Tents and shacks spread beyond the main blocks as newcomers arrive faster than carpenters can frame permanent structures. Men work underground in cramped shafts that drip water and foul air, then spill out into noisy streets at shift change. Cave-ins, explosions, and sudden gas pockets kill or maim with little warning. Tom finds work where he can, sometimes as a railroad laborer moving ties and rails, sometimes driving teams that haul ore, timber, or supplies. The pattern of his life in these years is simple. He hires out, puts in hard days for cash, and moves on when pay dries up or trouble around him grows too hot. In these mining towns, the line between lawful authority and hired muscle is often thin. Company guards stand at mine entrances with rifles, ready to turn away anyone they do not trust or to break up gatherings that look like the start of labor trouble. Local law officers balance the demands of mine owners, saloon keepers, and gamblers, trying to keep order without shutting down the flow of money that keeps the towns alive. Tom watches how quickly disputes over claims, wages, or cards can turn violent. He sees that men who control property and payrolls often hire others to do their rough work, keeping their own hands technically clean while their wishes are carried out at gunpoint. This pattern, in which respectable figures lean on tough outsiders to enforce their will become central to his later life. But in these years, he is still only an observer who happens to be comfortable with hard terrain and hard jobs. The decisive turn toward the desert frontier comes in 1881, when he takes a position on a mail hack line between Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Prescott, Arizona. The route stretches hundreds of miles across country that includes high plains, broken mesas, and dry basins. Stages and lighter mail wagons move on regular schedules that do not pause for heat, cold, or rumors of raiders. Tom now spends his days gripping the reins of teams that have to be pushed through deep sand, steep grades, and sudden storms. Dust coats his clothes and eyebrows. In bad weather, sleet and freezing rain soak him to the bone. He learns the sequence of stations spaced along the route, places like Beaverhead where water, forage, and fresh teams can be found if everything is working as planned. When it is not, he and whichever helper rides with him have to improvise repairs to harness, wheels, and axles with limited tools, because stopping for long can invite theft or attack. The stretch of country he traverses is not just physically harsh, it is contested ground. Small settlements cling to river bottoms and springs. Ranchers, miners, and traders push deeper into areas that Apaches and other native groups still regard as their own. Military posts sit at key points along the route, sending patrols into the hills and washes in an effort to track raiding parties and enforce federal policy. Tom sees evidence of that conflict in burned coach remains, bullet scars in stage doors, and station keepers who never move without a firearm within reach. At some stops, soldiers share the yard with civilian freighters, their uniforms dusty and their expressions tired. The talk that reaches Tom's ears in these places is full of raids on ranches, retaliatory campaigns, and names of officers and scouts who are building reputations fighting in the canyons and mountains to the south. His familiarity with the route makes him useful beyond simple driving. When a herd of mules needs to be delivered to Beaverhead Station to support Army supply work farther west, he is a natural choice. Moving stock over that distance requires more than just endurance. Water must be rationed carefully between animals and men, grazing planned so that the herd does not strip one spot bare and weaken before reaching the next. Tom applies the same attention to ground and weather that he learned in earlier years, but now the stakes include government property and military schedules. The journey brings him deeper into Arizona, toward posts that exist entirely to project federal power into contested territory. His skills as a stockman and his willingness to take demanding assignments under rough conditions mark him as someone the Army can use. When he reaches Camp Verde, he finds a post made up of adobe and timber structures clustered along the Verde River. The troops stationed there head out on patrols, guard supply movements, and watch over nearby native communities. Civilians and contractors fill the spaces between official roles, handling freight, animals, and other support work. Tom is hired first as a night herder responsible for keeping the Army's animals from straying or being stolen under cover of darkness. The job ties him directly to the daily machinery of a military post. He sleeps light, wakes at the smallest sound, and moves through corrals and picket lines with a rifle or carbine close at hand. Any failure on his part can mean missing mounts at dawn, which in turn can cripple a patrol or delay an operation. On September 7, 1881, an officer named William Wallace Wotherspoon formally hires him as a teamster at Army pay. The paperwork recorded in quartermaster records lists his name beside a monthly wage that, while modest, is reliable compared to the uncertain money of cattle drives and mining camps. His duties expand to driving supply wagons that link Camp Verde with other posts and remote stations. He hauls rations, ammunition, and equipment along roads that are little more than rutted tracks, always with the understanding that he may run into hostile parties or bandits as easily as bad mud or broken bridges. The Army provides an organized framework and chain of command that is very different from the chaotic discipline of trail outfits and mining crews. But the underlying reality remains the same. Force and the threat of force back every order. Moving in and out of these posts, Tom encounters men whose names will later be attached to the Apache campaigns, including the chief of scouts whose job is to find and fix enemy bands in rough country. At this stage, he is not yet the kind of specialist whose word can redirect columns or whose decisions decide lives on both sides of a fight. He is still an employee who handles animals and wagons, yet his reliability under strain and his ease in rough terrain put him in a position to be noticed. Each trip into the backcountry deepens his knowledge of canyons, water sources, and tracks, and each successful delivery reinforces the idea among officers and contractors that he can be trusted with more important tasks. By the early 1880s, standing on dusty parade grounds and in wagon yards under the Arizona sun, Tom has fully separated himself from the world of Missouri fields and Kansas stables. He now lives inside a system where the law he serves is written in orders stamped with federal authority and carried out at the muzzle of Army weapons. The skills he built through years of hard work and observation have brought him to the edge of a new role, one in which he will no longer simply move supplies or watch animals, but will act as the eyes and eventually the weapon of the government in its war against the people who resist its reach. The step from driving teams to scouting armed columns is not large in distance, but it will mark the beginning of the part of his life that makes his name both respected and feared. Early 1880s to September 4th, 1886. Arizona Territory does not offer much comfort to anyone wearing government pay, and it offers even less to a civilian who sleeps in the same dust as soldiers, but carries none of their rank. At posts like Camp Verde and Fort Apache, Tom Horn moves from wagon yards to corrals and backcountry roads, hauling grain, flour, and ammunition where officers tell him to go. The pay is regular, The food is barely adequate, and every task takes place within the shadow of a war that never fully stops. Raiding parties hit ranches and wagon trains, then melt into canyons and timber. Patrols ride out to punish them and come back with empty saddles and wrapped bodies. Horn works close enough to see that the army is stretched thin and angry, and that there is always room for someone who can read sign and stay calm under fire. The man who first makes real use of those abilities is Al Sieber, the chief of scouts in Arizona. Sieber is already a recognized figure, a veteran of earlier campaigns who carries scars and moves with a deliberate limp. He has no patience for boastful men who cannot back up their talk on the ground. Horn earns space near him not with speeches but with visible competence. He keeps animals steady when shooting starts near the post. He brings wagons in on schedule over bad tracks. He moves through brush and rock with the quiet of someone who has been watching trails since boyhood. When Sieber needs reliable men to handle pack trains and act as additional eyes on the edges of patrols, Horn is on the short list. San Carlos Reservation, where Sieber spends much of his time, is a hard place for everyone. The government has pushed Apache groups from scattered homelands into this single area along the Gila and San Carlos rivers. Ration houses, agency buildings, and lines of wickiups sit under a sun that burns away any illusion of comfort. Yet within that tight, monitored space, Apache scouts sign on to work for the same army that once hunted them. They carry rifles and ride with columns into country they know better than any officer. Horn follows Sieber there as a civilian assistant, handling stock, keeping packs in order, and learning enough Apache words to follow simple conversations. The men in uniform see him as part of the machinery that keeps expeditions moving. Not yet as a hunter, but Sieber notices that he listens more than he speaks and that his eyes never stop measuring ground and people. On August 30th, 1881, that uneasy arrangement between scouts, soldiers, and reservation Apaches fractures at Cibecue Creek. An army column under Colonel Eugene Carr rides out from Fort Apache with the stated purpose of bringing in a medicine man named Nock Idet Klina, whose influence among the White Mountain people alarms agency officials. Scouts, enlisted men, and packers move along the narrow creek bottom, leading and driving stock through brush and shallow water. Horn is among the civilian scouts attached to Sieber, one more armed man in a column that assumes its own superiority. The sky is clear, the trail looks quiet, and the mood in camp is tense but routine. The ambush erupts when the column is in its most vulnerable posture, strung out along the creek crossing and steep bank. Apache warriors who have moved into position on the surrounding slopes open fire from above, sending bullets down into the massed soldiers and animals. Men fall in the water and on the rocks. Horses rear and crash into one another. Captain Edmund Hentig, one of the officers in front, is hit early and goes down. Confusion spreads as shouted orders vanish under the crack of rifles. Scouts who once wore the Army's badge now shoot at the same troops they scouted for, turning the expedition into a vicious argument conducted entirely with bullets. Sieber reacts by gathering the men he trusts most, among them Horn and the mixed-blood scout Mickey Free, and pushing them toward higher ground. They scramble up rocky slopes under fire, using every fold in the land to shield their bodies. Horn feels rock fragments and dust strike his face as rounds hit near his hands and knees. He focuses on small tasks, not on the panic in the wash below. He picks targets who show themselves on ridgelines and tree trunks, works the bolt, and fires with the same careful aim he once used on fence post bottles in Missouri. Only now there is no practice element and no second chance for the men who expose themselves. The elevated position they reach allows them to return steady fire into the positions attacking the main body, and their presence, combined with the efforts of regular troops, eventually blunts the assault enough to let Carr's command pull back. When the firing slackens toward dark, the cost is obvious. Several soldiers lie dead or wounded, and the column has gained nothing except a hard lesson about the limits of its authority and the fragility of its alliances. Bodies are gathered in the difficult light and buried under field conditions that allow no ceremony beyond a few spoken words and the brief notes of taps. Horn helps move the dead, lifting limp weight, feeling how quickly violence erases rank and individuality. The smell of blood and spent powder hangs in the air while men dig a common grave under Carr's direction. If anyone had imagined that one expedition and one arrest would display federal control, that belief dies with the men in the ground. For Horn, the fight proves that even an organized military column can find itself on the edge of destruction when enemies choose the ground and the moment. The next year, the conflict shifts into the rougher terrain north of the Mogollon Rim. In July of 1882, a band of White Mountain Apaches under a leader named Natiotish raids along the Tonto Basin and flees into the upper reaches of East Clear Creek, an area of steep canyons and broken pine country. Army forces from the 3rd and 6th Cavalry move to intercept them near a place that will be known as Big Dry Wash. Sieber again rides as chief of scouts, and Horn is part of the mixed group of civilian scouts, packers, and enlisted men attached to the operation. By now, his reliability in the field is an accepted fact. Officers trust him to carry out orders without complaint, and Sieber trusts him to stay composed when the situation deteriorates. At Big Dry Wash, the Apaches choose ground along a ravine that gives them both cover and a clear field of fire toward approaching soldiers. The fight begins in the afternoon, with cavalry companies trading shots with warriors concealed among rocks and timber. The air fills with gunfire, shouted commands, and the impact of bullets on stone and wood. As the engagement stalls, Sieber, Horn, and Lieutenant George Morgan move along the banks to a position opposite the Apache line. The maneuver requires them to crawl, slide, and run in short bursts through an area where any exposed movement can draw immediate fire. Horn stays low, keeps his weapon ready, and concentrates on reaching the next bit of cover rather than counting the distance. Once in place, their group adds a new angle of fire against the Apache position. Shots from their rifles hit from an unexpected direction, forcing defenders to shift attention and exposing them to renewed pressure from the main force. The battle runs into evening, and a storm brings heavy rain and hail, soaking clothes and fouling ground. By nightfall, Natchiotish's band is pressed hard enough that the survivors slip away into the darkness, leaving dead behind. Several soldiers are killed or wounded, and the field bears deep scarring from the fight. Horn emerges from the engagement with a sharpened reputation among officers and scouts alike. He has proven that he can move into places where others hesitate, and that he can keep his head clear in a fight that might easily have gone the other way. Between large engagements, the daily work continues in smaller grinding tasks. At San Carlos, Horn spends long stretches escorting officers, carrying messages, and watching over Indian scouts who travel with Sieber. He learns more of the Apache language and earns a nickname that reflects his constant talking in that tongue. He also sees how the reservation system compresses people who once moved freely into a narrow strip of land where rations and rules define their choices. On one day, he rides into the hills with scouts who wear army blouses and carry Springfield rifles. On another, he sees families lined up for flour and coffee at agency buildings, waiting on the same government that once chased them. That contrast between service and confinement hangs over every interaction. In 1883, General George Crook takes columns deep into the Sierra Madre in Mexico to hit Chiricahua camps that use the international boundary as a shield. Horn goes south as a packer, one of the men responsible for keeping the column supplied in country where regular wagon roads do not exist. He helps load and unload mules, keeps panniers balanced, and moves with long strings of animals along narrow routes that cling to mountainsides and drop into steep canyons. Each day begins in the dark with the sound of bells and snorting animals and ends in temporary camps where cooks work over small fires and sentries watch ridgelines for movement. On those marches, he sees the aftermath of attacks and counterattacks, burned wiki-ups, scattered household goods, and hastily abandoned camps mark places where Chiricahua families once slept. In other locations, soldiers find signs of recent feasting and celebration, then ashes and bodies from raids on Mexican villages or ranches. Horn is not asked to judge the rights and wrongs of these actions. His task is to keep the pack train moving and to help the scouts and soldiers when they close on enemy camps. The Sierra Madre campaign reinforces a pattern he has already begun to understand. The Army does not distinguish sharply between warriors and communities when it carries the fight into hostile ground, and any person who takes its pay is expected to accept harsh consequences without hesitation. As the Apache campaigns drag on, responsibility for dealing with the Chiricahua shifts from Crook to General Nelson Miles. By 1885, Geronimo and a small group of followers have left the reservation again, raiding in Arizona and New Mexico, then slipping back into the mountains of Sonora and Chihuahua. Miles inherits a tired army and a population demanding final resolution. In that climate, experienced scouts are prized. Horn's long service under Sieber, his knowledge of the country, and his ability to work with Apache scouts move him into a more central role. By late 1885, he holds the job of Chief of Scouts under Captain Emmett Crawford in southern Arizona, responsible for supervising Apache auxiliaries and other civilians who ride ahead of the main columns. The work ties him closely to men who know the land far better than any officer. Apache scouts move quietly along ridges and through arroyos, searching for sign of Geronimo's parties. Broken grass, faint hoof marks on stone, scraps of cloth, and old campfires all speak to them. Horn coordinates with them, relays information to Crawford, and rides in advance of supply trains to find routes that will not trap wagons or pack animals. When they locate strongholds, he helps plan approaches that allow soldiers to close in without alerting their quarry too soon. The job requires both patience and a readiness to use violence as soon as orders come. Every success pushes Geronimo's followers into smaller and more exhausted circles, but it also reveals how resilient they are. In early 1886, Crawford tracks Geronimo into the Sierra Madre again. The column moves deep into Mexican territory with Apache scouts out front and packers, including Horn, struggling to keep supplies from running out. The campaign placed soldiers and scouts far from permanent posts, dependent on what they can carry and what they can seize. Horn later describes the atmosphere in terms that show constant expectation of contact and danger. Columns move through pine forests, across cold creeks, and along ridges where a single shot could signal either an ambush or the end of an enemy party. At one rancheria, Crawford's men hit a camp at dawn, scattering its occupants and seizing animals and weapons. At another, they find only ashes and tracks leading higher into the hills. On January 10th, Mexican irregular troops moving under orders to protect their own territory stumble on Crawford's camp in the Sierra Madre and mistake it for a hostile gathering. Confusion and poor communication make the situation lethal in minutes. Shots rip through tents and into men who thought they were sleeping under friendly control. Horn is present when the firing starts. He throws himself toward cover and reaches for his weapon, but the fight is chaotic. Apache scouts, American soldiers, and Mexican militia all shout in different languages, and no one controls the engagement. In the exchange of fire, Crawford is mortally wounded. Horn takes a bullet in the arm, a hot, tearing impact that leaves his hands slick and his sleeves soaked. The clash ends only when officers and interpreters make the situation clear. For Horn, the incident is a brutal confirmation that even when he works under formal authority, His life can be taken by error as easily as by enemy action. He is patched up as best the field conditions allow and continues his service with a scar that stiffens his arm in cold weather. The death of Crawford removes a commander who valued him and leaves Miles with one less experienced officer, but the campaign continues. Geronimo is still at large, and Washington demands closure. Riding with columns in the final pursuit of Geronimo, Horn applies the full range of skills he has built. He scouts ahead in rough country, rides with Apache auxiliaries who try to persuade relatives to come in, and passes messages between officers and scouts who do not share a language. He understands enough Apache and Spanish to follow conversations and to help clarify simple exchanges. Though the main burden of interpreting at key councils rests on other men and on Apache scouts who speak both tongues fluently. His value lies in his ability to move between groups, stay on the trail, and remain steady when fatigue and frustration eat at everyone involved. By late summer of 1886, the net tightens. Lieutenant Charles Gatewood, accompanied by trusted Apache scouts, reaches Geronimo's camp in the Sierra Madre and convinces him to come in under promises of fair treatment. Horn is part of the wider ring of Army forces positioned to make sure that surrender turns into reality rather than another escape. On September 4th, near the railhead and military presence that represent the full weight of United States power in the region, Geronimo and his followers give up. Soldiers line the area, officers stand in charged groups, and Apache families sit or stand nearby under guard. Weapons are stacked, and names are taken. Horn stands among the scouts and packers who have spent years in this grinding pursuit, watching the man they have hunted for so long step fully into custody. The ceremony of surrender is brief and controlled. There is no open celebration among the troops, only a release of tension that shows in shoulders and hands. Apache scouts who served the Army know that they too face removal from the land they have known, and any sense of victory is mixed with unease. Geronimo and his people will be shipped east as prisoners, far from the ranges and canyons where their lives once unfolded. Horn sees them moved toward trains and guarded columns, then turns back to his own duties. The war that gave him a position of influence as chief of scouts is effectively over, and the skills that made him valuable in that context will soon be turned on different targets. He has learned that law backed by federal power can crush resistance without mercy, and he has learned that men who serve that law can use lethal force under orders and sleep without consequence from courts. Those lessons will shape every choice he makes when he steps out of uniformed service and into the private wars of cattlemen and detectives, 1886 to early 1890. After Geronimo's surrender, when the Army no longer needed long campaigns into the Sierra Madre, Tom Horn took his pay and headed back to a quieter strip of Arizona he already knew, the rough country of Aravaipa Canyon. The creek cut through steep walls and ledges with stretches of narrow bottomland where grass and brush survived the dry seasons. That canyon had seen raiding parties, patrols, and freighters in earlier years, but by the late 1880s, more men were trying to turn it into a permanent home. Horn joined them, not as a scout this time, but as a small rancher who thought he finally had a chance to build something of his own. He put together a modest spread rather than a grand outfit. About 100 head of cattle and a couple dozen horses ranged under his brand along Aravaipa Creek and its side draws. A rough dwelling, corrals, and a few outbuildings sat above the water, close enough that he could hear it move over gravel at night. He also filed a mining claim in the Deer Creek district nearby, hoping that ore might someday support the stock business during lean years. For a man who had spent most of his adult life carrying out other people's orders, that cluster of cattle, horses, and earth represented independence. He rode fence, branded calves, and checked water himself, often alone for days. The country around him was far from settled peace. Bands of cattle thieves and horse raiders worked the same canyons and ridges where he rode. Some were locals with small herds trying to improve their numbers quickly by taking unguarded calves. Others were drifting criminals who crossed and recrossed the border, driving stolen stock toward distant markets. Horn had seen livestock theft from the perspective of an army scout, but it took on a different shape when every missing animal carried his own brand. He started sleeping lighter and checking sign around his place with more suspicion. A set of tracks near a gate, a cut wire, or an unfamiliar rider on a ridge could mean that someone was measuring his herd for a midnight visit. The raid that ended his ranch came without warning. One night, under cover of darkness and distance, thieves moved into Aravaipa Canyon in force. They knew enough about the layout of his place and the habits of his animals to strike quickly. Horses were cut out of corrals and driven to join cattle pushed through open gaps where fences had been cut. Hooves churned dry ground and shallow water as stock moved away from the homestead. By morning, the corrals were nearly empty, the range oddly quiet, and Horn's mark stood on animals already far beyond his reach. There was no practical way for one man to chase a driven herd across rough country and recover it from raiders who knew how to blur their trail and mix stolen animals with their own. He rode out anyway, following tracks as far as he could, reading the ground for any sign that the thieves had faltered. The marks showed organized work, several riders, many animals, and careful handling where they crossed hardpan or rock. When the trail thinned into scattered sign that could no longer be followed with certainty, he had to turn back. The loss was not just a reduction in numbers. It wiped out the core of his operation. 100 cattle and 26 horses represented years of labor and nearly all of his invested savings. Without them, the buildings on the creek bank were nothing but boards and nails, and the mining claim was an unproven hole in the ground. There was no insurance to cover the theft and no county force strong enough to guarantee recovery. Officers and deputies might sympathize, but they were already struggling to hold together basic order over large distances. A small rancher whose herd had vanished in the night had little choice beyond starting over somewhere else or hiring private help he could not afford. Horn faced the fact that his experiment as a self-reliant stockman had ended in a single night of organized stealing. Bankruptcy was not a word used in many camp conversations, but it was the reality he lived. That experience fixed livestock thieves in his mind as enemies, not just nuisances. From that point on, dealing with rustlers would not be an abstract duty handed down in orders. It would be personal. With the Aravaipa venture ruined, he turned back to the kinds of work where his skills brought reliable pay. He mixed short stretches of mining with stock jobs, moving through communities in central Arizona where ore, cattle, and timber underpinned small economies. In those years, news and rumor traveled along saloon bars, supply counters, and campfires. One conflict in particular dominated talk east of the Mogollon Rim, a long, ugly struggle in a remote valley that most people in the territory now knew by a single phrase: Pleasant Valley. Pleasant Valley sat in Tonto Basin, an isolated pocket of meadows, timber, and canyons where grass and water drew ranchers despite the difficulties of access. There, two family groups, the cattle-raising Grahams and the Tewksburys, who had started in cattle and then brought in sheep, had slid from partnership into bitter enmity. By the mid-1880s, shootings, ambushes, and disappearances had already scarred the valley. In one incident, a Navajo sheepherder working for the Tewksburys was shot and killed on the Mogollon Rim. His head was removed and buried near the body. Both factions accused the other of responsibility. Horses vanished, cabins were watched through gun sights, and the dead were buried without trials. The feud had grown into a range war that drew in allies, hired riders, and opportunistic killers. According to the account he later wrote, Horn heard from men coming down out of this turmoil in the spring of 1887. They described a rustler war, in which stock thieves had the upper hand, and in which local law needed someone who understood both rough country and rough men. He was tired of scraping at a mining claim that promised little return and of drifting from one short contract to another. The idea of paid work that combined his tracking, riding, and fighting skills with the authority of a badge appealed to him. When the chance came to go north toward Pleasant Valley, he accepted. He based himself out of areas that gave him access to both the feud country and to territorial officials. Around Globe and Tempe, he took employment that put him in touch with people who had interests in Pleasant Valley, including Robert Bowen, a rancher and hotel operator with ties to the region. While working in that orbit, he moved into the valley itself as a hired hand and as a man wearing different kinds of authority. In later descriptions, he claimed that he served as a deputy under lawmen such as William Owen, Bucky O'Neill, Commodore Perry Owens, and Sheriff Glenn Reynolds. Whether every detail of those claims can be traced in official records or not, it is clear that he acted in concert with officers whose job titles gave cover to hard measures. Pleasant Valley did not operate under the neat lines of a textbook dispute. Stock identities were contested, brands questioned, and grazing rights argued with rifles rather than petitions. Men rode in small groups, some open about which side they favored, others more careful. Cabins were built as much for defense as for shelter, with firing angles planned in case enemies appeared. When shots came, they were often fired from ambush or at least from positions chosen in advance, because any man who stood in the open too long risked never reaching his horse again. In that environment, the difference between a posse and a masked gang could be only a matter of who wrote the report afterward. During the late summer of 1887, an older stockman named Martin, usually called Mart, Blevins rode out to look for horses he believed had been taken. He never returned. His mount and rifle were later found, but his body was not recovered. Conflicting stories spread quickly. Some said he had fallen to Tewksbury allies. Others pointed at men connected with the Grahams. Horn, who was then working on a ranch linked to Robert Bowen and operating in and around the valley, became one of the suspects in whispered accounts. No court ever brought formal charges against him for that disappearance, and the exact circumstances of Blevins's death remain undocumented. What did become fixed in local memory was the sense that men like Horn, who moved between factions under color of law, were deeply involved in balancing the valley's death ledger. Even when no single name could be attached to a killing, the pattern of violence grew more brutal. In the months after Blevins vanished, cabins were fired on at night, livestock were shot in corrals, and riders disappeared on lonely stretches of trail. The war pulled in new participants. The Blevins sons rode with Hashknife, cowboys, and other allies, searching for answers and often bringing more gunfire instead. Deputies and posses were formed to make arrests, then found themselves trading fire with men who claimed to be defending their homes. The already thin gap between legal force and revenge shrank further until some actions carried both badges and masks. In August of 1888, 3 men named Scott, Stott, and Wilson, connected with the Graham side, were taken into custody as suspected stock thieves. They were supposed to be moved under guard along a remote section of trail. Somewhere along that route, they ended up dead, hanged from a tree and shot. The bodies bore the marks of both forms of killing. Horn would later describe riding with Sheriff Glenn Reynolds in connection with this episode, presenting the lynching as the work of men who believed formal courts could not deal adequately with persistent rustlers. Whatever exact sequence led to the nooses and gunshots, the message to anyone in the valley who thought about taking livestock without permission was unmistakable. For residents already exhausted by years of bloodshed, these killings did not bring real peace. They deepened fear and hardened resentments. Families barricaded themselves in cabins or fled the basin entirely. Relatives of the dead made lists of names they believed responsible and waited for a chance to even scores. Every rider in the area had to wonder whether a face seen at dawn would still be alive at dusk. Horn continued to work in this environment, riding under warrants at some times and under private instructions at others. The tasks differed in paperwork but not in outcome. He scouted trails, watched certain ranches, and joined groups sent to capture or eliminate men fingered as thieves. The work suited some parts of his character. He was already used to operating in small units with limited supervision, carrying a weapon, and making quick judgments based on tracks and behavior. In Pleasant Valley, those skills translated into a form of killing that did not have to answer to military discipline. There were no general orders written in careful language, only terse instructions and a shared understanding that some men would not return. The presence of sheriffs and deputies gave a frame of legitimacy to some operations. But even then, the end result often matched the outcomes of ambushes carried out by declared enemies. Men died without trial, and the valley's grave count climbed. By the time the worst of the feud burned itself out, both the Graham and Tewksbury factions had lost most of their adult males. Outlying allies and hired hands had also fallen. Some were shot down in open fights, others in ambushes. Still others vanished like Mart Blevins with only circumstantial tracks pointing to their fate. Horn's name threaded through many of the stories that survivors told later. To some, he was a necessary enforcer who helped keep organized rustlers from stripping the country bare. To others, he was a killer who used a loose association with lawmen to give cover to murder. The one consistent element was that he had been there, moving between camps, often arriving when someone's troubles were about to turn lethal. When he finally drifted away from Pleasant Valley toward new work, the basin he left behind was quieter because there were fewer people left to fight. The feud had solved almost nothing in terms of property disputes, but it had removed many of the men who once contested them. For Horn, the Arizona years between the fall of Geronimo and the early 1890s marked a personal shift. He had gone from soldier's scout to small rancher, then from ruined stockman to a man who killed under the loose shelter of a badge in private wars. The theft that destroyed his Aravaipa ranch had convinced him that courts were useless against determined thieves. Pleasant Valley gave him a proving ground to apply that belief. He emerged from it more convinced than ever that warnings backed by bullets when needed were the only effective way to protect property. That conviction would guide his next steps as he moved north into new range wars where the line between lawful killing and murder grew even thinner. August 31st, 1890. After dark on the Denver and Rio Grande Western line between Cotopaxi and Texas Creek in Fremont County, Colorado, a mail train rattles through the canyon with bags of currency and registered letters while two masked men with guns wait beside the rails, and the robbery they stage will hand Tom Horn the first case that shows him exactly what the Pinkerton badge expects from him. When the train reaches the isolated stretch of track, the engineer sees armed figures and a signal to stop. The air is cool coming off the Arkansas River, and the canyon walls block most of the moonlight. The robbers climb into the mail car, force the clerks at gunpoint to open pouches and pull out packages heavy with coin and paper. They move quickly, tossing aside letters that look personal, cutting open sacks that look valuable. A few minutes later, the train pulls away, shaken crew still at their posts, and the two thieves disappear into the broken country on horseback with what the railroad later lists as several $1,000s in cash and valuables. Word goes out at once that the line has been hit again, and that this time the company wants results instead of excuses. In Denver, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency keeps its western office above a busy downtown street. The building smells of coal smoke, ink, and sweat. Inside a back room away from the front desk where clients sit, operatives gather at long tables to listen to instructions from supervisors. Tom Horn stands among them, lean from years in the saddle, his new suit hanging a little loose over a body used to army fatigues and range clothes. He has already spent months learning how the agency wants its work done, taking in lectures on surveillance, report writing, and the careful handling of informants. The men in charge like his cool manner and his ability to pick out detail on a trail that most men never see. When the railroad asks for its best tracker, his name comes up immediately. The superintendent lays out the facts in flat language. A Denver and Rio Grande Western train robbed on a narrow stretch between Cotopaxi and Texas Creek. The mail clerks held under the muzzles of revolvers, pouches cut open, several sacks gone. No one dead, but the company angered. Horn receives copies of the conductor's and mail clerk's statements, a rough map of the track, and a list of possible suspects. He notes the mention of a man known as Pegleg Watson, said to be dangerous, and an associate called Bert "Red" Curtis. The instructions are blunt. The railroad wants the cattle country to see that its trains cannot be robbed without a prompt answer. Horn steps off the train at Cotopaxi with another Pinkerton agent, C.W. Shores. The tiny settlement lies tight against the river, wood smoke hanging low in the cool air. They walk the right-of-way, question section hands and station workers, note where horses could have been hidden in the brush. The ground is stony, but Horn finds sign anyway. A few clear hoofprints in soft soil where a seep crosses a side trail. A dropped match. A flattened patch of grass where a man waited on his belly to watch the passing train. He walks the banks and looks for where a rider might ford without leaving much trace. Every bit of sign points south and east, away from the high country and into rougher territory where the robbers can vanish among people who do not care for lawmen. For days, Horn and Shores ride long hours following faint tracks and asking questions in saloons, camp kitchens, and at lonely homesteads. Horn listens more than he talks. He lets people study his worn hat and quiet eyes and draw their own conclusions about whether he is a lawman or another drifting cowboy. Piece by piece, he learns that Watson and Curtis left the state in a hurry and headed toward Indian Territory. The trail leads them across state lines and into the Washita country, where the river bends through cottonwoods and sandbars and where men with trouble on their backs often hide out. Near the Washita River, they hear of a man named Wolf who takes in strangers. The house sits back from the water behind a fringe of trees. Horn and Shores wait until early morning, watching from a distance until they see smoke creep out of the chimney and someone step outside to draw water. They ride in as if they belong there, rifles across their saddles, faces calm. Inside the house, Watson's wooden leg rests against a chair. Curtis's red hair is visible through a doorway. Both men reach for guns, but Horn is already standing with his Winchester leveled. The room is close, the wallpaper faded, the smell of damp clothes and cheap coffee strong. No one fires a shot. Watson and Curtis see in Horn's face that he will shoot if they push him, and they let their hands fall away from their weapons. Later, Horn will write that Watson had a reputation as a desperate character. Yet in that room, Horn has no trouble with him at all. The badge and the rifle, backed by the full weight of a railroad and the Pinkertons, carry enough threat to make resistance pointless. The successful capture earns Horn praise inside the Denver office. The agent who can take down armed train robbers in another territory without bloodshed is worth more than a dozen routine operatives who spend their days watching petty thieves in city alleys. In the weeks that follow, he sits in on briefings that show him the broader reach of his new employer. Pinkerton contracts line the files, covering everything from guarding payroll shipments to breaking strikes and infiltrating labor unions. The agency is hired by railroads, banks, and mine owners, people who expect the men they pay to guard property with every tool at hand. Private detectives testify in court when convenient. But the real work often happens out on lonely ground where there are no witnesses and no clear boundaries between enforcing justice and defending a client's profit. Horn understands this world without any need for explanation. The Army taught him that violence delivered without hesitation can decide whether a column lives or dies. The range wars in Arizona showed him that courts often protect whoever can afford the best lawyer, not whoever tells the truth. Now he wears a badge that answers to a private office in Denver instead of to a sheriff or an Army captain. The instructions he receives are shaped by business letters and telegraph messages from boardrooms rather than by territorial legislatures. To the men who hire the Pinkertons, rustlers, train robbers, union organizers, and even some witnesses are all just different categories of threat. In early April 1891, Horn walks through the Palace Hotel in Reno, Nevada. Under chandeliers that throw light across polished wood and tables piled with gold dust and currency. A faro game draws a crowd in one of the rooms, the stack of house money on the layout higher than usual that night. Later newspapers and court records will describe an armed robbery of the faro bank by men who force the dealer to hand over the stakes at gunpoint. When the smoke clears and witnesses begin to talk, Horn's name surfaces. Local authorities arrest him for the crime. In the jail, Horn keeps his temper under control. He knows the Pinkertons will not let a valued operative sit in a cell without counsel. Word travels back to Denver and the agency moves quickly. Bail money appears. An attorney arrives to argue on Horn's behalf. At trial, witnesses give conflicting accounts and the jury does not agree on a verdict. One panel fails to reach a decision, and a second finally acquits him. Horn later boasts that he pulled the job and that his employers paid him his regular wage throughout his time behind bars. Whatever the full truth, the outcome underlines a hard fact. The man who hunts criminals for private clients can also commit crimes under their protection as long as those clients decide the act serves their interests or at least does not harm them. By the time Horn finishes with the Reno case, tension on the northern plains has already been building for years. Wyoming's open ranges are changing. The terrible winter of 1886 to 1887 has killed vast numbers of cattle. Large outfits aligned with the Wyoming Stock Growers Association struggle to protect what remains of their herds. They blame small settlers and independent ranchers for taking up land and water they claim as their own, and accuse many of those settlers of branding unclaimed calves. New laws favor the stock barons, but juries drawn from the broader population do not always return the verdicts those barons want. Frustration hardens into a willingness to use private force. Violence in Johnson County escalates. In 1889, Ella Watson and her partner Jim Averill are lynched on the Sweetwater, accused of cattle theft. In the months that follow, other hangings and shootings stain the record. Detectives and hired gunmen in the pay of the large ranchers ride the country, watching, threatening, and sometimes killing. When two small ranchers, John A. Tisdale and Orley Ranger Jones, hear the names of men involved in a failed assassination attempt on a young leader of the Small Stock Association, they are later ambushed on lonely trails and shot down. No court ever proves who pulled the triggers, but word spreads among both cowboys and lawmen that the big cattle interests have paid professionals to silence dangerous witnesses. Into this atmosphere rides Tom Horn, Pinkerton badge in his pocket and his own history of tracking and killing behind him. The agency assigns him to Johnson County work under an alias, Tom Hale. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association wants someone who can move quietly through the Powder River country, measuring herds, talking to hands, and separating rumor from fact about rustling. Pinkerton supervisors want their man inside this volatile conflict, both to protect paying clients and to keep an eye on a situation that could draw national attention. Horn arrives in a landscape of rolling sagebrush, scattered ranch houses, and half-frozen creeks. Small outfits with a few hundred head push up against estates of powerful men who dine at the Cheyenne Club and send telegrams to state officials as easily as they send orders to cowhands. Horn rides from ranch to ranch, sometimes introducing himself as a drifted cowhand, sometimes as a representative of the big cattle interests, depending on who answers the door. He sits in dim bunkhouses while wind rattles the boards, listening to cowboys complain about wages, bad winters, and cattle missing from brands. He counts calves at roundups and notes which brands seem to have grown faster than they should have given the losses of the harsh years. He files reports back to both Pinkerton's supervisors and the WSGA, reports that list names of suspected rustlers and detail where they live and how they move stock. As months pass, the split between large ranchers and small outfits widens. A group of smaller operators forms the Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association, determined to stand against the larger WSGA. Their most outspoken voice, Nate Champion, works a modest holding known as the KC Ranch. Champion keeps a journal and speaks publicly in defense of the small men. The big cattle interests view him as a direct threat. They already suspect that juries can be swayed when local men sit in the box. They do not intend to let another public trial give their opponents a platform. Plans are laid that have nothing to do with subpoenas or courtrooms. In early April 1892, a force of armed men assembled by the WSGA moves north toward Johnson County. Some are prominent citizens and ranch managers, others are Texas gunmen with long records of violence. They carry a list of names, men they intend to kill or drive out. Before they reach the KC Ranch, smaller violent acts have already paved the way. John Tisdale and Orley Jones lie dead, their killers still at large. Rumors throughout the county link paid assassins to those murders, and among the names whispered as possible shooters appears Tom Horn's. No indictment ever reaches him for those deaths, but a Pinkerton colleague later states that William Pinkerton himself believed Horn responsible while refusing to let the agency be tied publicly to the crime. The raid on the KC Ranch is open war. The armed party surrounds Champion's cabin before dawn. A companion, Nick Ray, steps into the doorway that morning and takes a bullet. Champion hauls the wounded man inside under fire. Shots hammer the cabin walls for hours. Smoke from black powder drifts low in the cold air. Champion writes in his journal about being alone, about the steady gunfire, about his intention to break out if the cabin is set ablaze. When the attackers finally fire the building, he runs out through smoke and flame and is cut down by bullets. The killers pin a note to his body warning that cattle thieves will die. The siege shocks the region. A posse of armed men from Buffalo and nearby ranches rides out to confront the invaders. The WSGA force retreats to the TA Ranch where it is surrounded until the United States Army intervenes and leads them to safety. Despite the trails of bodies behind these events, very few of the powerful men who planned the operation suffer lasting punishment. Legal efforts falter, and the message on the ground is clear. Wealth and political influence can shield organizers of a private war, while the paid killers and detectives who ride for them remain out in the cold when the public mood turns. During and after this conflict, Horn moves through the same country, gathering information and acting as a bridge between the Pinkertons and the cattle barons. Some neighbors swear they see him riding with the invaders. Others place him nearby, but not in the direct line of fire. Surviving records do not settle the matter. What the records do show is that the WSGA keeps using him for work that pushes beyond ordinary investigation. His skills as a tracker and a long-range rifleman honed in Arizona and on Army Scouts are now applied in a place where being suspected of rustling or of supporting rustlers can lead to a grave without any formal charge. Inside the Pinkerton organization, opinions divide. Some supervisors admire Horn's results in difficult terrain. Others worry that his methods and the work he does for the cattlemen bring the agency too close to outright murder for hire. Public criticism of Pinkerton tactics grows after violent strike-breaking in other states, and the agency's leaders become more cautious about operatives whose work cannot easily be defended in court. A detective who arrests train robbers without firing a shot fits the public image they want. A detective whose name appears in rumors surrounding political killings in Wyoming is a liability. By 1894, the relationship breaks. Horn is called in and told he no longer works for the Pinkertons. The formal explanation speaks of a need to reorganize and of changing conditions in the West, but the real reason is clear enough. The agency does not want to carry responsibility for a man whose employers ask him to do work that falls outside the limits of what even a hard-used private detective company is willing to defend. Horn listens, nods, and walks out with his saddle rifle and the same cold conviction that has carried him through every previous shift in his life. If one set of lawmen will not sponsor his brand of justice, another will. The big cattle outfits in Wyoming and Colorado know exactly what he can do, and they no longer have to share him with any organization that pretends to care about courtroom appearances. In the high country between Colorado and Wyoming, the years around Horn's dismissal mark a turning point. The Johnson County War and the killings tied to it have drawn national newspaper coverage. Eastern readers see illustrations of burning cabins and armed posses on the march. Politicians in distant capitals debate the reach of corporate power over frontier justice. The open use of large armed bands becomes less acceptable, at least in public. Instead, ranchers who want to control ranges look to quieter methods, sending out individual gunmen and detectives to remove problems without attracting headlines. Tom Horn steps into that role without hesitation, carrying his rifle and his belief that a single shot delivered from cover does more to settle a dispute than any verdict read from a bench. The law still signs his pay, but its shape has changed. It now moves through contracts, private letters, and sealed instructions, and it expects him to keep his mouth shut and his distance even as he pulls the trigger. 1894 to 1898. When Tom Horn walked away from the Denver office of the Pinkerton Agency, he did not leave violence behind. He traded one set of employers for another. In place of railroad companies and corporate detectives, he now answered directly to men who controlled entire blocks of range north of Cheyenne. John Cobble at the Iron Mountain Ranch Company, Henry Bosler, and other stockmen in the Wyoming Stock Growers Association saw in Horn a tool that no court could match. A man who would ride into a troubled valley and make their problems vanish. The badge was gone, but the authority behind him was still wealth, influence, and an understanding that no jury in Laramie County was going to rush to defend a suspected cow thief. The country he entered in those years had a hard, stripped look. The grass around Iron Mountain was short and gray from too many cattle and too many dry summers. Wind cut through the draws and down the North Laramie and Horse Creek valleys, rattling loose boards on lined cabins and snapping at unpainted shingles on settler houses. Between the big outfit's headquarters, small claims sat along creeks, families living in one-room houses of lumber or sod, trying to turn a few branded calves in a garden patch into a future. To the men who hired Horn, many of those small places were little more than cover for theft. To the families who lived there, the brands they used were their only protection against being swallowed by the large herds around them. Horn rode into that tension with a reputation that did most of his talking. When he took a job in a neighborhood, he did not hide. One rancher on the North Laramie River later described watching him ride up the creek in plain view of every homestead, not stopping at a single door. Within days, several settlers packed up and left, selling their claims and cattle at whatever price they could get. No shots were fired, no arrests were made, yet rustling in that stretch dropped away. The message moved from cabin to cabin faster than mail. Tom Horn was in the country, and people who had been skimming calves or cutting brands suddenly had business in some other state. The cattle barons were content to let fear do the early work. Horn's first tasks as a range detective were the same jobs he used to do with a badge. Long days in the saddle watching for strays that did not match the brand on their mother, following tracks along creeks and counting how many calves on a small place carried marks that matched a big outfit's cows. He questioned cowboys, drifted through line camps, and listened in saloons. When he decided someone was stealing, a warning usually came first. Sometimes it was a spoken threat passed in a dark corner of the street in Cheyenne or Laramie. Sometimes it was a crudely written note tacked to a door or left in a corral. The words changed, but the meaning stayed the same. Leave this country or die in it. Horse Creek, southwest of Iron Mountain, became the place where those warnings turned into bodies. The valley there was open and rolling, with low ridges breaking the wind and thin strings of willows marking the water. Small ranchers had settled along it, among them a man named William Lewis. Lewis grazed his stock on the same range the big outfits claimed, and he had more enemies than friends. Neighbors remembered his temper and his habit of accusing others whenever something went missing. By the middle of 1895, he was in open dispute with the larger ranches over cattle and range. Death threats had begun to circulate, and he believed someone had already taken a shot at him. On the morning of August 2nd, 1895, Lewis made a tour of the nearby homesteads, angry and frightened after a bullet struck near his feet. He accused everyone he spoke to of trying to bushwhack him and gave his own threats in return. Then he went back to his place on Horse Creek and stepped into his corral to handle his stock, still convinced that if anyone wanted to fight him, they should do it face to face. The man who came for him never stepped into the corral. A rifle cracked from a hidden position and a heavy bullet hit Lewis in the chest as he stood by the fence. He sagged against a rail, tried to push himself upright, and 2 more shots knocked him to the ground. Neighbors who arrived later found him dead where he fell. The dust scuffed from his last struggle, the cattle milling around the body. The tracks of the shooter were too far off and too faint to lead to an arrest. Deputies examined the scene and concluded that the shots had been fired from long range by someone who knew how to use a rifle. No one had seen the killer clearly enough to name him. In official records, William Lewis was another murdered rancher in a county that already had too many. Around kitchen tables and in the back rooms of Cheyenne saloons, people did not speak so vaguely. Tom Horn had been in the district, riding a gray horse, working on behalf of the same cattle interests that had complained the loudest about Lewis. Years later, in a conversation with lawman Joe LaForce that would be repeated at trial, Horn himself described killing Lewis in the corral, and even boasted about how carefully he handled his cartridges afterward so that nothing at the scene could be traced back to him. To his employers, the murder looked like a neat solution to a problem that court injunctions and brand inspections had not solved. The killing did not stop with Lewis. Roughly 3 weeks later, another Horse Creek rancher, Fred Powell, went down under gunfire. Powell had also been accused of stealing cattle from both the Iron Mountain Ranch and the Swan outfit. He had received anonymous threats telling him to get out. Unlike Lewis, Powell had not gone around blaming every neighbor he had. He tried to keep working. On the day he died, he was in his hayfield cutting and stacking while a hired man took a team to the creek to cut willows for repairs. Out there on the open ground with no cover, Powell was an easy target. Sometime while the hired hand was away, a rifleman took up a hidden position, waited until Powell bent to his work, and shot him. When the hired man returned, he found his employer dead among the windrows of cut hay, the horses nervous and the tools dropped where they had been used last. As with Lewis, there were no witnesses who could swear to the killer's identity. More than one person had been seen in the area on a gray horse in the days before the murder, but by the time deputies arrived, those riders were gone. The evidence collected at the scene amounted to a body, disturbed grass, and distant hoof marks. Again, the case never made it to a jury. But when investigators later questioned Horn about his career, he calmly put a price on both deaths, describing how his pay for Powell and Lewis had been counted out away from the scene, part of what he called his business. He discussed killing as a trade, something he performed on order for money, no different in his mind from roping or scouting. In that dry valley on Horse Creek, the distinction between law enforcement and hired assassination had vanished. The effect of the Horse Creek murders spread far beyond two homesteads. Word moved through Albany and Laramie counties that men who had ignored the warning notes were now lying in their own corrals and fields. Families that had been stalling for time packed up wagons and headed east or south, leaving cabins empty and fences falling. Brother-in-laws and neighbors who thought about taking over the abandoned places quickly found their own threats tacked to doors, reminders that whoever had killed Lewis and Powell was not finished. Some men left within the time specified in the notes. Others did not wait that long. The houses they left behind became visible proof that the big outfits had found a way to clear the range without calling a single sheriff's jury. Horn justified all of it to himself as work in defense of property. To him, a rancher who took cattle that did not belong to him stood in the same category as the Apaches he had hunted in Arizona. In his mind, the fact that his targets were white settlers rather than warriors on the warpath did not change anything. The law, as enforced in town, had failed to protect the interests of the cattle barons he served. He believed his rifle did what the courts refused to do. If a man was guilty in his eyes and had been warned, the killing that followed was, to Horn, a simple transaction. He did not describe remorse in his conversations. He spoke instead about technique, payment, and the need to conceal his tracks. In 1896, another man with money and enemies disappeared between Horse Creek and the railroad. He was known locally by the name Campbell, and people who dealt with him believed he had a substantial amount of cash hidden on his place. The last witnesses to see him alive said he had been traveling with Tom Horn. After that, Campbell was gone. His money did not surface in any estate, and no one in authority proved exactly what had happened on that trip. There was no body to examine, no bullets to weigh, only absence. On the range, that was enough. Campbell's name went onto the whispered list of men who had crossed the big outfits and vanished after crossing paths with Horn. Even while these killings and disappearances hardened his reputation, Horn continued to cultivate work as a man who solved problems. That year, he wrote to the marshal in Tucson, offering his services against a gang of rustlers led by William Christian. He described himself in that letter in practical terms, not as a lawman bound by procedure, but as a man who could get results. He had spent years in Arizona as a deputy and scout. He knew the country and the people, and he made it clear that he was willing to remove Christian and his associates if the price and conditions suited him. Whether the town chose to hire him or not, the letter showed how he now saw his role. Law, in his view, was something that could be bought and delivered through him, not an impartial standard applied to rich and poor alike. Back in Wyoming, his primary base remained the Iron Mountain Ranch Company. The headquarters there was a cluster of buildings in a country of rolling grass and broken ridges, a place that served as a resting point between jobs and a stronghold for the men who paid his wages. From that hub, he ranged out along the North Laramie and into the country west of Cheyenne, watching homesteaders, checking brands at water holes, and reporting to Cobble and other cattlemen whenever he saw something they did not like. When he rode into a valley, some ranchers came out to shake his hand and ask about rustlers down the line. Others shut their doors and watched from behind curtains, wondering whether the next anonymous note would carry their names. The law still had a presence in the region, sheriffs and deputies who rode out from town when there was a shooting or a stock association complaint. Many of those officers knew Horn from earlier campaigns and shared campfires with him while they questioned witnesses. Some saw him as an ally, a man who gathered information they could use. Others worried aloud that the cattle barons had created something they could not control, a gunman whose authority came from private money rather than public office. But as long as juries in Cheyenne and Laramie failed to convict anyone for the Valley murders, as long as stock losses dropped and the big ranches stayed in business, there was little appetite among local leaders to put Horn himself on trial. Through those years from 1894 to 1898, Horn aged into his 40s, but the miles in the saddle and the work he took kept him lean and hard. Nights in line cabins with other cowboys, he still told stories from the Apache campaigns and from the Pleasant Valley feud. But now he added tales about the Horse Creek killings, sometimes with a kind of grim pride. He drank heavily when he came into Cheyenne, but even drunk he kept control of his temper. He knew that a barroom shooting would draw the kind of attention his employers did not want. His violence stayed out on the range, carried out under cover of distance and brush, where a rifle cracked once or twice and left only bodies and rumors behind. By the end of the decade, the cattle industry across the plains was shifting again. The worst of the earlier crashes had passed, but the open range was shrinking under the pressure of more fences and more settlers. The fights between cattle and sheep were sharpening, especially around Iron Mountain, where men like Kels Nickel would soon bring bands of sheep onto ground the cattle barons considered theirs by right. Horn's career as a range detective had already proven how far those barons were willing to go. On Horse Creek, the corpses of Lewis and Powell marked the price that had been paid to clear the range. As new conflicts brewed, the men around Cheyenne who had once paid him to scout for the army now saw him as the obvious choice to enforce their will again. In 1898, events far from Wyoming briefly pulled him away from that work. The United States went to war with Spain, and former officers from the Apache campaigns began to appear in newspapers and army orders. General Nelson Miles, who had watched Horn scout and pack mules in Arizona, called for experienced men to serve in Cuba. For a man like Horn, used to hard marches and accustomed to taking orders from Miles, the summons was another chance to turn his skills into steady pay under a flag rather than a brand. The range around Iron Mountain, with its emptied homesteads and its unmarked graves, lay behind him as he answered the call, carrying into the tropics the same cold view of killing that had just reshaped a corner of Wyoming. June 14, 1898, transports loaded with soldiers and mules began to ease away from Tampa, and Tom Horn stood on a crowded deck watching the harbor fade while the heat wrapped around every man on board. The new war against Spain had pulled him out of the Wyoming wind and back under Army authority, this time as chief packer for the 5th Corps. He had come to Florida after contacting old officers who knew his work with mules and pack trains. The job was civilian, but the chain of command ran through General William Shafter, and Horn understood that when those officers wanted supplies on a Cuban ridge, his trains had to get them there or men would die in place. Before the troops sailed, Horn had already spent weeks in the camps around Tampa and at other staging points, sorting animals and men into trains that could function under fire. The Army had brought in hundreds of mules from western ranches, half broken, half wild. All of them needed to carry ammunition, rations, and medical stores where wagons could not go. Horn moved through the picket lines with a practiced eye, picking out steady animals for the lead strings and assigning packmasters who understood how to keep a column together when rifles started cracking ahead. Many of the packers had never left the United States before, had never seen combat, and now they took instructions from a man whose whole adult life had been spent in border campaigns and range feuds. On the transport decks, the air smelled of animals, sweat, and cheap tobacco. Men from regular infantry regiments crowded against volunteer outfits and rough riders bound for notoriety they had not yet earned. Horn paid less attention to the arguments and bragging than to the loading slings and ramps that took his animals aboard. Mules slipped and braced as they were hoisted from the docks. If one broke a leg in the process, it meant another empty spot in a string that was already too short for the load demands ahead. He had spent years in Arizona learning how to keep pack trains functioning in rough country. Now he had to make that experience cover a war in the tropics. The crossing to Cuba was slow and cramped. Soldiers slept in any open space on deck or below, packed between cargo piles and gun mounts. Horn spent most of his time near the mules, checking lashings and talking quietly with his packmasters about landing procedures. Storms were a concern, but so was confusion. When the invasion fleet reached the Cuban coast near Daiquiri and Siboney, the beaches offered no proper docks. Animals would have to go down ramps or into the water and swim ashore. A panicked mule in the surf could drown a handler and block the landing for every string behind it. Horn had seen chaos ruin well-planned movements before. He knew that if the pack trains did not reach the beach intact, the commands inland would run short of what they needed. The landings took place in humidity that seemed to cling to the skin. Soldiers waded ashore in lines, uniforms already soaked, rifles held high. Horn followed with mules that snorted and balked at the edge of the surf, before lunging forward under shouted orders and the sting of quirts. Some animals went under and scrambled back up through the foam, eyes rolling white. Others made the crossing in a single steady push. By the time the Fifth Corps had its feet on Cuban soil, Horn's trains were forming up behind the beach with ammunition boxes, canned rations, medical panniers, and officers' baggage stacked in rough order. The rough ground inland would shape the rest of the campaign. Cuban roads leading toward Santiago were narrow, rutted tracks hemmed in by brush and jungle growth. When rain came, the surface turned into deep mud that sucked at hooves and boots until lines stalled. Horn rode alongside his pack columns, shifting loads when animals tired and sending men back down the trail to locate stragglers. Spanish skirmishers and Cuban guerrillas were somewhere ahead and to the flanks, trading shots with American scouts. The pack trains had no rifles in their saddle scabbards to match infantry volleys, but every crate they carried represented food and cartridges for the men on the firing line. Horn understood that an overloaded animal that collapsed in a ditch could mean a shortage of ammunition at the front hours later. As the campaign moved toward the heights around Santiago, Horn saw more of the regular infantry and cavalry units he had heard about in camp. Black soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry slogged through the same mud as white volunteers carrying carbines and field gear in the heavy air. The Rough Riders, many of them Western cowboys and small-town men, pushed forward on foot after leaving their horses behind due to transport limits. Horn's pack trains followed behind the main columns, halted when the fighting stiffened, then moved forward as soon as officers ordered more supplies to the front. Shell bursts in the distance marked Spanish positions on the ridges above Santiago. Horn had spent years in canyons and on mesas, and he recognized high ground that could cut apart an assault if not supplied and supported properly. On the day of the attack on the San Juan Heights, his pack animals were on trails exposed to rifle and artillery fire meant for the climbing infantry and cavalry. Bullets snapped through leaves and over the tops of loads while packers urged their strings forward. Men hit the ground when fire grew too intense, then rose to push and pull mules around fallen branches and bogged spots. Horn's work that day did not involve charging a trench, but it did require keeping animals and men moving along paths that Spanish gunners could see. He later described watching the assault against the ridgeline, noting the behavior of the Rough Riders and the Black regiments as they advanced into fire and continued upward despite casualties. Disease soon became an enemy as dangerous as the Spanish troops. The low country around Santiago held standing water and swarms of insects. Latrine pits overflowed in the rain. Horn kept the trains working, but the men under him began to falter. Fever hit without warning. Pack handlers who had spent their lives in dry western air now lay shivering on rough blankets, skin hot, eyes dull, muscles seized by cramps. Yellow fever and other tropical illnesses moved through the camps and along the trails. Some men never rose again. Horn himself contracted what was described as yellow fever. At one point he lay in a hospital tent, weak and sweating, while other packers tried to keep the trains operating under skeleton crews. For a man who had built his reputation on endurance, the temporary helplessness burned as much as the fever. The formal combat ended with the surrender of Santiago, but the suffering in the camps continued. The army began pulling units back from Cuba, fearful that disease would wipe out more men than Spanish fire ever had. Pack trains were broken down, animals redistributed or shipped home, and civilian specialists like Horn were mustered out or discharged from service. He survived the fever and regained enough strength to travel. By the time he left the tropical climate, his body carried new scars from illness, and his mind carried another campaign's worth of memories in which death often came not with a bullet but with heat and infection in crowded tents. When he returned to the United States, Horn did not linger in eastern cities. The West still offered work that matched his skills. In Wyoming and Colorado, the cattle business had changed again while he was in Cuba. More homesteaders had come in, fencing parcels of land once considered open range. Sheepmen continued to push flocks into areas long dominated by cattle outfits. The old networks of influence that had hired him before the war were still in place. Stock associations and large ranch companies remained determined to protect their holdings against anyone they defined as a threat. For them, a man who had just served as chief packer in a foreign war looked even more dependable. Horn resumed contact with figures such as John Cobble and other cattle leaders who had used him in earlier disputes. Now conversations in Cheyenne and on ranch verandas included questions about Cuba, alongside talk of rustlers and encroaching flocks. Horn answered with straightforward accounts of the campaign, emphasizing the work of moving supplies under fire and the discipline needed to keep trains functioning in rough conditions. The stories confirmed what those ranchers already believed about him. He was a man who could operate under pressure, accept orders from higher authority, and treat the movement of ammunition and food in a war zone as a practical problem to be solved rather than a romantic adventure. By 1900, he extended his reach beyond Wyoming range disputes into northwest Colorado. The Swan Land and Cattle Company and allied interests targeted a pocket of country along the Green River and in Browns Park, an isolated valley on the border of Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. The landscape there was rugged. Steep bluffs and broken ridges framed a broad bottomland where cottonwoods grew along the river. The isolation had made it a haven for riders who did not want close supervision from law officers or stock detectives. Men branded cattle there under local association rules that did not always match the expectations of distant investors. Horn arrived in that region with the same tools he had used everywhere else: a rifle, range experience, and the backing of powerful employers who wanted specific people removed. He traveled under the name Tom Hicks and took work among the very cowboys he had been sent to investigate. In bunkhouses and at line camps, he listened to conversations about cattle numbers, brands, and sales. He watched who drove which herds and which animals showed up under altered marks. The pattern in Browns Park followed the one he had seen before the war in Wyoming. Large outfits accused smaller associations and individual ranchers of skimming stock that did not belong to them. The smaller men claimed they were only taking unmarked calves or working under local agreements. The dispute turned dangerous when distant owners decided that the time for court filings and letters had passed. Troopers and volunteer infantry in Cuba had seen Horn in the role of a non-combatant specialist who made their supply system function under fire. Ranchers in Wyoming and Colorado saw something else: They saw a man whose years in Apache country, Pleasant Valley, Cuba, and Horse Creek had stripped away any hesitation about using a long-range rifle on human targets. They knew he would take employment that blurred the line between law and murder and then carry it out without dragging his employers into a courtroom. After his return from the Spanish-American War, that perception hardened. In their eyes, he was no longer just a former scout and range detective. He was a veteran of a modern conflict whose skills had been tested on another continent. In the high country along the Green River and on the plains near Iron Mountain, the pattern of threats, warnings, and ambushes that had already stained Horn's record was about to shift from scattered killings to a series of assassinations that drew national attention. The war in Cuba had given him fresh authority and another layer of experience. Back on the range, the combination of that record with the growing desperation of cattle barons set the stage for the next round of quiet, deliberate shootings that would make his name stand for higher death rather than frontier scouting. July 8th to October 3rd, 1900. Browns Park lay along the Green River where Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming pressed together, a basin of cottonwood bottoms and sage ridges that had always drawn people who liked distance between themselves and law officers. Ranchers like Herb and Elizabeth Bassett had built spreads there in the 1880s. Their daughters, Josie and Ann, grew up riding among outlaws who used nearby canyons as refuge. Butch Cassidy and his friends drifted through on occasion. Smaller cattle outfits, including those owned by Madison Matt Rash and his partner Issam Dart, shared the grass with herds that carried the marks of distant stock companies. Above them all stood big owners tied to outfits such as the Two Bar and the Swanland and Cattle Company, men who watched every missing cow as a loss taken straight from their ledgers. By the late 1890s, the fight over that grass had hardened. Cattle poured into the valley from the herds of Ora Haley and other large operators, grinding some slopes into bare soil. Local stories told of big drives meant to choke out small men by eating every blade between the green and the yampa. In response, Browns Park riders did not always wait for courts. Bodies of branded steers were found below cliffs along the river. Bands of sheep appeared where cattle barons least wanted them. Quietly and not so quietly, the small outfits pushed back against herds that seemed endless. On paper, the law stood with whoever held the oldest brands and the deepest pockets. On the ground, the fight tilted back and forth with each season. To the large cattle associations, men like Matt Rash and Issam Dart stood at the center of the trouble. Both had come from Texas and driven cattle north, working for outfits in Wyoming before settling in Browns Park. By 1900, they controlled good spreads, one near the bottomlands, another up toward Cold Spring Mountain. Neighbors called Rash a solid hand and a capable organizer who took a leading role in the Browns Park Cattle Association. They described Dart as one of the best bronc riders on the range, a man who could cook for a crew, shoe a horse, then pick up a fiddle and entertain children in the evening. At the same time, some big ranchers and their foremen said both men used roundups to slide unmarked or questionably marked calves into their own strings. To the small outfits, they defended their share of a country that had never been claimed only by distant investors. In the spring of 1900, a stranger rode into Browns Park under the name Tom or James Hicks. He gave friendly explanations to anyone who asked. He was looking for land, he said, maybe a place of his own. Around a campfire, he claimed past work as an Indian fighter and trailman. He let slip details about Mexico and Arizona, about pack trains and desert campaigns that made some experienced listeners uneasy. Where most cowhands talked more about horses and weather, this Hicks recited accounts of men he had watched die, told with the same flat tone another man might use to describe a branding tally. Ann Bassett later wrote that his bragging about human slaughter disgusted her, and that arguments flared when she challenged him. Despite that reaction, Hicks found work easily. The Browns Park Cattle Association needed help for the spring roundup. Rash, who served as association president and ran a busy outfit in the basin, agreed to hire the newcomer as cook and hand. Hicks moved into the flow of the season without protest. He fried meat and sourdough in the morning, then stood just far enough back from the corral roping to watch which calves went under which irons. Out on the circle, he paid close attention to cattle that drifted between herds, noting brands and earmarks, memorizing which small operators trailed which strings off the common range. He seldom asked direct questions, but he listened whenever ranchers argued about brands or grass rights. While Hicks worked from the association camp, a separate set of conversations took place at larger headquarters to the north. At the two-bar ranch managed for Ora Haley by H.H. High. Bernard, riders, and neighbors came and went with gossip and grievances. Later, a local man named George Banks swore in a written statement that he overheard Bernard speaking with Hicks and another hand known as Mexican Pete. In that account, Bernard laid out a simple, brutal plan. Certain people in Browns Park were to be removed outright. Others were to receive warnings to leave. Payment would be available at the two-bar when the work was done. Among the named targets were Rash, Dart, a neighbor called Longhorn Thompson, and members of the Bassett family. Warnings soon began to appear in the valley. Notes ordered particular men to clear out within a fixed time or face deadly consequences. The language matched the threats that had circulated earlier in Wyoming range wars. In Browns Park, these papers did not come pinned to courthouse doors. They turned up on ranch gates or among personal effects, including a letter later reported found with Dart's belongings that named the Bassett brothers and cowboy Joe Davenport and gave them 60 days to get out. Some recipients chose to spend the winter elsewhere. Others read the threats, cursed the writer, and stayed with their herds. Rash and Dart fell into that second group. After the spring work, Hicks left the roundup. Bassett remembered him giving a flimsy excuse to Rash and riding away. The newcomer who had talked so much about past fights vanished from the camps and cabins, but his absence did not end the tension. Big outfits still complained that the Browns Park Association was harboring thieves. Smaller ranchers still muttered that the cattle barons aimed to own every blade of grass from one horizon to the other. The valley drifted into early summer, carrying all those grudges. On the evening of July 8, 1900, Rash sat down to supper in his cabin with a tall visitor who introduced himself once more as Hicks. The small house stood near his corrals, with rough lumber walls, a simple table, and a bunk pushed against one side. Outside, his saddle horse grazed near the door. Inside, dishes clinked while the two men ate. The conversation has not survived in any reliable form, but neighbors later agreed on the basic outline. Hicks accepted his host's hospitality, finished the meal, rose from the table, and stepped outside. Rash followed shortly after. What happened next was recorded in the coroner's notes and in the memories of the people who found the body. A single rifle shot split the air near the cabin. Rash's mare went down almost where she stood, hit by the same or an immediately following shot. Rash himself took a heavy bullet that tore through his body. Somehow he managed to drag himself back inside, leaving a blood trail across the threshold and floorboards. He collapsed on his bunk and reached for paper, trying to leave a final message. When neighbors arrived after he failed to appear the next day, they found him dead in the cabin with a sheet bearing smeared marks that looked as if he had attempted to write the name of his killer but lacked the strength to finish the letters. The scene outside showed how little chance he had been given. The dead horse lay close to the door, hit broadside. There was no sign of an exchange of fire, no overturned chair on the packed dirt to suggest a struggle. Whoever had pulled the trigger had done so from cover with a clear line to the doorway. Tracks around the area were confused by ranch traffic. Investigators from Routt County took statements, inspected the cabin, and filed their report. The inquest concluded that Rash had died from a gunshot delivered by an unknown party. In the park, people supplied their own name for the unknown. Shortly after the killing, Hicks appeared again among Brown's Park residents. When Ann Bassett accused him directly of murdering her fiancé, he and some bystanders treated the charge as a dark joke. The stranger with the stories about slaughter listened to the accusation, denied it, and then put the valley behind him. No deputy arrested him, and no prosecutor brought him before a judge in connection with the July shooting. Rash's ranch, built through hard years of trail work and loans from distant banks, passed into other hands while the man most locals suspected rode on to his next job. 3 months later, the gunman returned to finish the list. Dart's place sat higher near the top of Cold Spring Mountain, a cabin and corral set against the rough slope. The air there turned cold early. Frost came down from the ridges while cattle still worked the last of the grass. After Rash's death, Dart understood how dangerous Brown's Park had become. Rather than ride out, he brought in friends he trusted. Sam and George Bassett spent time at his cabin, sleeping under the same roof and helping with the work, believing that a house full of armed cowboys would discourage any bushwhacker. Dart still ran his horses and cattle, still played music in the evenings, but he no longer treated threats as idle talk. On the morning of October 3, 1900, Dart left the cabin to tend to his stock. Accounts placed the time just after daybreak, when the light was gray and the ground crusted from night cold. He stepped out with his hat pulled down and walked toward the corral, a short distance across open ground. Inside the cabin, the Bassetts and others moved about in the cramped space, getting ready for the day. The shot that killed Dart echoed off the side of Cold Spring Mountain without warning. The bullet struck him in the chest. He dropped where he stood between the house and the corral. The men inside rushed out, weapons in hand, but saw no one on the slope. The country around them was broken by patches of brush and scattered trees, with plenty of cover for a marksman who knew how to pick a concealed position. They reached Dart and found him beyond any help. Later searches of the hillside turned up a likely firing point beneath a tree that offered a clear view of the cabin door and the path to the corral. Near its roots lay spent rifle cartridges of the type used in a .30-30. Riders in the valley told officers that only one man known in the area at that time carried that model. By the time any lawman followed the trail, the shooter was already far from Cold Spring Mountain. As with Rash, the official inquest into Dart's death reached a narrow conclusion. The jury found that he had died from a rifle shot fired by an unknown person. Newspapers in Craig and other towns covered the killing but could point to no indictment. Among neighbors, the verdict carried little weight. To them, the pattern was too plain. The same range detective, former scout, and one-time Pinkerton hand who had come under the name Hicks, worked for Rash, and sat at his table before the July shooting, had now hidden himself on a ridge above Dart's cabin and fired once when his target stepped into the open. Dart's friends buried him near the place he had tried to defend. Before the grave was filled, Eb Bassett removed a pair of leather wrist cuffs from Dart's body and kept them for years. The cuffs carried Dart's brand, a D over a half circle, along with carved stars cut by hand during long evenings. They stood out as one of the few physical remains tied directly to the killing, reminders that the man shot down on the way to his corral had been more than a name in a rustling dispute. He had been a neighbor who entertained children, a top hand trusted by ranch families, and an African-American cowboy who had carved out a respected place in a valley that was almost entirely white. The impact of the Browns Park killings reached far beyond two blood-stained doorways. After Rash and Dart fell, other small ranchers, who had received warning notes, decided the valley was no longer worth the risk. Some left quickly, loading belongings into wagons and driving their cattle toward safer ground. Others were pushed by further violence. Shots fired through Ann Bassett's front door came within inches of killing her as she sat at her table. On Thanksgiving Day that same year, Longhorn Thompson, another neighbor, barely escaped an ambush shot aimed at him. He soon left the country. By winter, the list of victims and near victims matched almost exactly the names that Banks had later written down in his account of Bernard's orders to Hicks. For the big outfits, the result looked like success. Men the barons branded as thieves were dead or gone. The Bassett family spent stretches of time away from Brown's Park. Joe Davenport, one of the cowboys warned in the letter found with Dart's effects, eventually made a new life as a policeman in Rock Springs. Control of the grass tilted toward the interests that had paid for the work. No court records show a formal contract, but letters, statements, and later recollections by witnesses all pointed in the same direction. A former Army scout and range detective had been hired to remove specific men and intimidate the rest. He had done so by moving into their community, sharing their food, then killing them with unseen rifle shots. News of the murders traveled alongside stories about the earlier Horse Creek deaths in Wyoming. When Tom Horn was later arrested for another killing, reporters and lawyers reached back to Brown's Park for examples of his methods. They found a valley where the line between private justice and outright murder had disappeared under the weight of cattle money. The deaths of Rash and Dart showed what happened when the skills of a government scout and a Pinkerton detective were turned fully toward hired assassination. The old pattern that let Horn carry out such work without fear of trial would not hold forever. The next shooting tied to his name would not end with a verdict of unknown party. And the same law he had claimed to serve would finally decide what price he would pay for years spent killing at the command of others. July 18, 1901 and after. The country north and west of Cheyenne rolled in gray folds, broken by the dark shapes of Iron Mountain and cut by shallow draws that carried snowmelt into the North Laramie. Wind scraped at wire fences and rattled loose shingles on scattered homesteads. For years, that wind had whistled over only cattle and the big brands that controlled most of the open range. By the turn of the century, bands of sheep moved in under men like Kels Nickel, and the land that once held only cows and barbed wire now carried wool and fresh fury. The Nickel family settled in that contested strip with a house, sheds, and a corral near the main trail. Kels and his wife, Mary, had children who worked the place as soon as they were strong enough to carry a bucket or drive a team. 14-year-old Willie was old enough to ride alone, open gates, and handle stock with a boy's pride. The family kept sheep along with cattle, a choice that guaranteed enemies among the big outfits that still believed sheep ruined grass, and that herders had no business on land the cattlemen had used for decades. Rumors about Kels cutting fences and moving animals where cattle barons did not want them started early and spread fast. On the other side of that feud stood the same kind of men who had once employed Tom Horn at Iron Mountain, Bosler and Miller among them. Ranchers who measured their holdings in tens of thousands of acres and thousands of cattle. To them, sheep on those hillsides were more than competing stock. They were a direct challenge to their idea of how the range should work. They had watched Horn clear Horse Creek by putting accused rustlers into their graves. When sheep began to graze on Iron Mountain, they saw no reason to change methods that had already brought them quiet pastures. Horn came back into their pay as a range detective, riding the country around the Nickel place with the same quiet routine that had frightened men from other valleys. He stayed at ranch houses friendly to the cattle interests, took meals in line camps, and turned up wherever brands and boundaries were being argued. He watched bands of sheep nose along the grass and noted which water holes they used. His reputation followed him into every dispute. Neighbors knew he had already left men dead on the ground in other states. When he rode past a homestead gate and did not stop, families inside the houses did not relax. They waited for warning notes or worse. Trouble at the Nickel place began with smaller strikes. In early summer, fences were cut in the night, and Kels found posts leaning, wires down, and gaps that let stock stray. There were ugly words at waterholes when cowboys from the big outfits met his herders. Shots rang out from far ridges during drives. One of Nickel's daughters believed men had taken deliberate shots in her direction as she rode. The family could not prove who fired those rounds. The effect did not depend on proof. Every time a bullet cracked over their heads, the message was that someone with a rifle wanted them gone. Sheep became targets as well as people. In one incident, clubbed and shot animals lay scattered near a Nickel camp. Heads were crushed, legs broken, bodies left where they fell. The killers had not bothered to drive the flock off. They had simply moved through it, swinging clubs and firing a few close shots, turning living animals into a stinking line of carcasses that had to be dragged off and buried or burned. For a family whose livelihood depended on wool and lambs, the destruction was more than spite. It was a direct attack on their means of survival. Each dead sheep meant less money, less food, and more debt. Despite the damage and the warnings, Kels did not run. He had put his family down in that country and believed he had as much right to graze stock there as anyone with a bigger brand and a deeper pocket. Willie helped carry that stubbornness. The boy rode the same trails his father did, drove sheep to water, and opened and closed the gate near the main trail every day. He heard talk around the table at night about threats and arguments. He knew men in the area hated sheep and hated his father. He kept doing his work anyway because that was the only way to keep the place running. On the morning of July 18, 1901, the air around the Nickel homestead was cool from the night. The light came in low across the hills, throwing long shadows from the fence posts and the scattered sage. Willie left the house in work clothes, moving toward the gate that opened onto the trail. Whether he rode or walked to that spot, witnesses later disagreed. What remained certain was that he was 14 years old, on his family's ground, handling the same routine chore he had done many times. The gate stood near brush and a small rise that offered cover to anyone who cared to wait at dawn with a rifle. At some point between his leaving the house and the family's next sight of him, shots were fired. A neighbor later reported hearing 2 cracks in quick succession that morning, sharp over the distance, distinct from the normal noises of ranch work. No one rushed out immediately. Gunfire on the range was common. Cowboys shot at coyotes, rolled cans along fences, and sighted in rifles between jobs. Another neighbor who took his breakfast near an open window decided the shots sounded closer than target practice should be, but he still did not saddle his horse at once. The interval between sound and response left a 14-year-old alone at the gate with a man and a rifle somewhere in the brush. When Mary noticed that her son had not come back from the gate and that his usual movements around the place were missing, concern took hold. She and others went looking along the path he would have taken. They found Willie lying near the gate, face down in the dust, hat fallen aside. He had been shot from ambush. One bullet had passed through his body, entering from behind. A second had struck as he lay on the ground, tearing deeper damage. Blood had soaked into the dirt around him and dried in clotted patches. There were no signs of a struggle, no indications that he had seen the shooter or had any chance to defend himself. The scene around the gate told a different story than the bodies Horn had left at Horse Creek and Browns Park. Those men were adults, armed and entangled in disputes over cattle. Here, the victim was a boy whose only offense in the eyes of his killers was his last name, and the fact that he worked for a sheep man. His small body in the dust marked a new low in the range wars, a step that shocked even hardened neighbors. When word reached surrounding ranches, riders came from all directions to stand over the boy and stare at the blood pooled around the fence line. Men who had sent their own children out to ride in that same country now had to imagine them in the place where Willie lay. Deputies and the county coroner made their way to the Nickel place. They examined the wounds as best they could in open air, noted the entry paths, and determined that a high-powered rifle had done the work. The angle suggested shots fired from a position slightly above and behind Willie. Investigators walked the nearby draws and brush patches looking for cartridge cases, boot marks, or hoof prints. They found some tracks, but the dry ground and the number of people who had already moved around the area made it difficult to separate the killer's traces from those of neighbors and family. There were no shell casings left in plain view. Whoever fired had taken care to leave little behind. Suspicion in the community did not scatter. It settled almost at once in a familiar direction. The Nichols had been in open conflict with men tied to big cattle outfits. Kels had been threatened and his stock attacked. Range detectives working for those outfits, including Tom Horn, had been seen moving through the area before the killing. Horn's presence near the Nickel place in the weeks leading up to the shooting was known. He had stayed at nearby ranches, spoken with cattlemen about sheep on Iron Mountain, and ridden past the very gate where the boy was found. To many in the area, it did not take formal evidence to decide which side had hired a man to pull a trigger. The official investigation, however, stalled. There were no eyewitnesses who could tie Horn or any other individual to the ambush. The tracks were too confused to support a clear identification. The coroner's jury ruled that Willie had died at the hands of parties unknown. The sheriff's office continued to ask questions, but without a confession or a witness, they could not lay formal charges against anyone. For the Nickel family, those legal limits offered no comfort. They had buried a child who had been shot in the back at their own gate, and the man they believed responsible still rode the same country. The violence did not end with the boy's death. In August, Kels himself was ambushed near his place. Shots tore into him and knocked him from his horse. He lived, but the wounds left him in pain and under the constant reminder that someone wanted not just his stock or his land, but his life. Around the same time, more sheep were killed in brutal fashion, left beaten and shot, their bodies rotting on the ground. The pattern looked less like scattered anger and more like a campaign, a series of strikes intended to break the Nichols' will and drive them from Iron Mountain. Neighbors began to speak more quietly when Horn's name came up. Some ranchers who had once welcomed him now watched him with a new unease. Killing adult men in a cattle dispute was one thing in their eyes. Setting up on a hill and shooting a 14-year-old as he opened a gate crossed a line that even some cattle barons hesitated to defend aloud. Still, the pay to Horn continued. He drew wages from cattle interests for his work as a range detective, money that kept him supplied and in the saddle. No employer stepped forward to distance himself publicly from the man whose presence shadowed the Nickel murders. Horn kept moving through the country, spending time at the Miller Ranch and with John Cobble, handling horses, talking about brands, and drinking in Cheyenne when he came to town. In conversations with other cowboys and officers, he still spoke with the same flat pride about earlier killings. If the death of a boy troubled him, he did not show it. He had long since reduced his work to a simple formula. Certain people were named as trouble. They were warned. If they stayed, they died. The Nickel family, in his mind, had been marked by cattlemen as enemies. That the first body to fall carried a child's age did not change the structure of the job or the pay. Fear gripped the Nickel household and the few neighbors who sided openly with them. Every ride to a water hole and every walk to a gate now carried the possibility of a rifle shot from unseen cover. Children looked up at ridgelines and brush, wondering if someone was watching them move. Kels lived with the knowledge that his son had been killed and that he himself had come close to joining the boy in the ground. Yet he still drove sheep along the contested trails. Leaving outright would have meant abandoning everything they owned. Staying meant living under threat. Law officers who were not tied to the cattle companies watched events with growing concern. Among them was a deputy United States Marshal named Joe LaForce, who had seen Horn work in other ranges and knew the stories from Brown's Park and Horse Creek. The combination of a dead boy, a wounded father, slaughtered stock, and a notorious range detective in the background pushed him toward action. He began laying plans to test Horn's habit of speaking too freely when liquor loosened his tongue. In the short term, nothing changed on the ground. The grave at the Nickel place stayed where it had been dug, a marker of how far the sheep and cattle war had gone. The cattle outfits kept their detectives and riders on the payroll. Sheep still grazed in patches across Iron Mountain. Horn rode under the same big sky he always had, confident that without a witness or a hand on his shoulder, no court could touch him. Yet the killing of Willie Nickel had planted something beyond fear in the region. It had planted the idea that there might be a limit to what even wealthy cattlemen could order and remain respectable. The law had failed to act after Horse Creek and Brown's Park. In Iron Mountain, the sight of a dead child in the dust began to shift that balance. The next time Horn talked about his work inside a fenced yard in Cheyenne, the words would not dissolve into camp gossip. They would become the core of a case that finally brought the force of the courts down on the man who had killed for the law until it turned and reached for him instead. Winter settled over Cheyenne in early 1902, hard enough to freeze water troughs and drive most talk indoors. But one subject kept men standing in yards and alleys long after their hands went numb. The killing of 14-year-old Willie Nickel still hung over the Iron Mountain country. No one had been charged. The Nickel family lived under constant threat. Sheep lay dead in fields, and Kels carried scars from an ambush that had nearly finished him. In saloons and bunkhouses, the same name came up whenever someone spoke about who had the skill and the motive to lie behind a rifle at that gate: Tom Horn. A deputy named Joe LaForce listened to those conversations and decided that if the law was ever going to lay hands on Horn, it would not happen through tracks in dust or cartridges found under trees. It would have to come from Horn's own mouth. LaForce knew Horn's habits. The range detective liked whiskey and talk when he came to town. He enjoyed telling about past work, especially when he felt safe among men who seemed to admire him. The deputy chose a spot away from crowded bar rooms, a stockyard corral behind the office of a cattle company where a man could speak freely without thinking about who might be listening from the next table. He told Horn that a group of Montana cattlemen needed a capable detective, someone who had already shown he could clear a range. There might be good money and steady work in it. The talk sounded like the kind of offer Horn would expect after years of deadly service for big outfits. On January 10th, 1902, Horn walked into that yard in Cheyenne with snow packed along the fence lines and the smell of cattle thick in the cold air. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who believed that his past killings had only made him more valuable. Deputy LaForce greeted him pleasantly, steered him toward a quiet corner, and handed him a bottle. While they drank, the deputy asked about the Iron Mountain trouble. He spoke in general terms at first about sheep, fences, and the need to protect property. Then he asked more sharply what had been done about the Nickel family and whether the boy's death had solved the problem. The words that followed would later be argued line by line in a courtroom. LaForce said that Horn admitted taking care of the situation, that he described waiting near the gate at dawn and firing on Willie Nickel from cover after earlier warnings had gone unheeded. According to the deputy, Horn spoke about the job as one more piece of paid work, gave the distance of the shot, and explained that he had taken care to avoid leaving evidence. A court stenographer, hidden close enough to hear through a window, scratched quick notes as the conversation went on. Another witness listened from a nearby spot. Both later repeated that Horn spoke in detail about killing the boy and that he did so without any sign of regret, treating the ambush as routine. Horn would claim afterward that he had only been boasting while drunk. turning gossip into self-promotion in hopes of impressing an employer. Whether he believed that explanation or not, the damage was done the moment he left the yard. LaForce put his notes in order and swore out a complaint. The next day, officers arrested Horn and took him into custody on a charge of murdering Willie Nickel. A man who had spent his life moving in and out of jails as a visitor, an escort, or an investigator now found himself on the other side of the bars. The Laramie County Jail sat not far from the same streets where Horn had once ridden in from the range to drink and talk. His cell was small and cold, with a narrow bunk, iron bars, and a thin window that showed only a slice of sky. Outside, reporters began to gather whenever a door opened. The case carried more than local interest. Telegraphed stories about the arrest of a well-known range detective for the murder of a child ran in papers as far away as the eastern cities. Some readers saw it as proof that the cattle barons had finally gone too far. Others thought it meant that a loyal servant was being sacrificed to ease public anger. Inside the jail, Horn met with lawyers hired with help from his friends among the ranch owners. They argued that the so-called confession was nothing but drunken talk. No one had seen Horn at the Nickel Gate that morning. The tracks at the scene had never been tied to him by clear evidence. The rifle used had not been recovered. Without the words from that Cheyenne yard, there would have been no case strong enough to take to a jury. Even with those words, the defense insisted the state had at most a story filtered through officers who already believed Horn guilty. Months passed while motions were argued and denied. A change of venue request failed. The judge ruled that the statements recorded by the stenographer and repeated by LaForce could be presented to a jury. Horn remained in his cell, reading, smoking when allowed, and talking with visitors through the bars. At times, he seemed confident that Western jurors would never vote to hang a man whose work had long benefited their neighbors and employers. At other times, especially in the long nights, he understood that this was not another range dispute to be settled with threats and quiet shootings. If 12 people chose to believe Joe LaForce, the rope waiting in Cheyenne would be for him. The trial opened in October of 1902 in a packed courtroom. Men who had ridden with Horn sat on benches beside people who had never left town. Reporters filled rows near the front, pencils ready. The state began by laying out the known facts. Willie Nickel had been shot in the back near his family gate on July 18, 1901. The family had long feuded with powerful cattle interests. Sheep and fences had been attacked. Kels had been shot and wounded. A man with a record of killing suspected rustlers for those same interests had been in the area. The prosecution then built toward its centerpiece, the conversation in the Cheyenne stockyards. Deputy LaForce took the stand and repeated under oath what he said he had heard from Horn. The stenographer, Otto Plunkett, read from his shorthand notes describing how Horn had spoken about the killing, including the number of shots, the distance to the gate, and the reason he believed the boy had to die. Another witness confirmed that a conversation had taken place and that Horn had talked freely about the Nickel case. The prosecution framed the entire exchange as a trap set for a man known to brag about his work. The fact that he had fallen into it, they said, only proved how sure he was that no one would ever call him to account. The defense cross-examined every witness. Horn's lawyers pressed the stenographer about gaps in his notes and asked whether he might have misheard or miswritten key phrases. They questioned LaForce about his motives, suggesting that the deputy wanted to make a name for himself by bringing down a notorious range detective. They brought in witnesses from the Cobble Ranch and other places to say that Horn had been there on the day of the shooting. At a distance they claimed made it impossible for him to have ridden to the Nickel place, killed the boy, and returned without being missed. They pointed out that no physical evidence tied him to the gate. No shell casings from his known weapons had been found there, and no one had seen him near the homestead that morning. Throughout the trial, Horn sat at the defense table in a suit that never looked quite natural on him, shoulders square, face usually calm. When former employers testified about his work as a scout and detective, they painted him as a capable, valuable man who had repeatedly placed himself in danger to protect stock and enforce order. Some of them admitted that they had used him to deliver threats to suspected thieves. None would admit to paying him to kill. On cross-examination, the state pressed those witnesses about how much they had benefited from the sudden disappearance of men they had accused of rustling. The implication hung in the air even when no one said it plainly. In the end, the case came down to whether the jurors believed the words recorded in that stockyard conversation. The physical evidence at the gate could not point to any specific shooter. Ballistic science had not yet developed to the point where rifling marks could convict a man. Alibis were uncertain, based on recollections of days that blurred together on the range. What did not blur was the deputy's testimony that Horn had described the killing in his own voice. The jury retired to deliberate with that question at the center of their discussion. Had a man too comfortable with violence finally talked himself onto a scaffold? When the jurors returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreman announced a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. Under Wyoming law, that verdict meant death by hanging. There was no second-guessing the sentence. The judge set a date for execution. Horn sat still as the words were spoken, then stood when told and was led back to the jail, now a condemned man rather than an accused one. Outside, reactions split along lines already drawn. Some cattlemen muttered that the state had just killed a loyal employee through legal means. Small ranchers and townspeople who remembered Willie's shallow grave felt that a measure of balance had finally been restored. Appeals stretched the process out for months. Horn's lawyers carried the case to the Wyoming Supreme Court, arguing that the confession should never have been admitted, that the jury had been swayed by reputation rather than evidence, and that too much weight had been placed on the words of a single deputy. The High Court upheld the lower ruling. Petitions went to the governor asking for commutation to life imprisonment. Letters arrived from men who had served with Horn in the Apache campaigns and from cattlemen who still saw him as a necessary tool on a hard frontier. Counter-arguments came from those who pointed to the age of the victim and to the string of unsolved killings that seemed to follow Horn across 3 states. The governor read all of it and refused to change the sentence. Locked in his cell with the clock now ticking toward an execution date, Horn turned to writing. With the help of a local journalist who supplied paper and encouragement, he set down his version of his life as a scout, interpreter, and range detective. He wrote about Arizona expeditions, Mexican campaigns, and Cuban marches. He described his work for cattle outfits in general terms, often presenting himself as an enforcer of order against rustlers and lawbreakers. He did not give detailed accounts of the Browns Park murders or the Horse Creek shootings. He denied killing Willie Nickel and insisted that his conviction rested on lies and misunderstandings. The pages he produced would later be printed as his autobiography, giving him a voice beyond the grave even as the rope waited. In the Cheyenne jail, he received visitors, among them John Cobble and other old associates. They brought tobacco, listened to his complaints about the case, and sometimes sat in uneasy silence. Guards watched as he paced the small corridor outside his cell during exercise periods, his movements still those of a man used to open country even though his world had shrunk to stone, iron, and wood. Past killings that had once seemed distant now pressed into every quiet moment. The faces of the dead could not be cross-examined, but their absence shaped how the public viewed the condemned man. Wyoming used a device known as a Julian gallows, built so that no hangman had to pull a lever at the final moment. A bucket of water sat on a platform attached to the mechanism. When a knife was pulled free, the water began to drain. Once the bucket reached a certain weight, it triggered the trap and dropped the prisoner. In the weeks before the execution, deputies tested and adjusted that machine in a yard within sight of the jail. The sound of the trap falling echoed against the walls, a mechanical rehearsal for the day when a man's body would be on the end of the rope instead of a sandbag. On the morning of November 20th, 1903, cold air and thin sunlight covered Cheyenne. Spectators gathered outside the jail and along nearby streets, held back by guards and local officers. Inside, Horn, dressed in clean clothes, accepted a last meal and spoke quietly with the priest who had been visiting him. He wrote a few final notes and handed small items to friends or guards. When the time came, deputies shackled his hands and led him out into the yard where the gallows waited. He climbed the steps without stumbling, face set, eyes steady. The rope hung in front of him, already measured and knotted. Reports from men who stood there that day agreed that he refused a blindfold. He stepped onto the trap and looked out over the handful of witnesses allowed inside the enclosure, among them officers, officials, and a few chosen observers. He spoke briefly, repeating his claim that he had not killed the nickel boy and thanking some of those present for past kindnesses. There was no long speech, no attempt to confess other crimes or to offer apologies for lives already ended far from that yard. The noose went around his neck. The hood stayed off. A deputy pulled the small blade that freed water from the bucket. For a short span of seconds, nothing happened. Then the shifting weight dropped the trap. Horn fell through the opening and came up hard on the end of the rope. The mechanism did its quiet work. Doctors checked for a pulse. When none could be found, they pronounced him dead. The body was cut down and prepared for burial. Later that day, the remains traveled by rail to Colorado for internment, far from the Wyoming hills where Willie Nickel had died and far from the Arizona canyons where Horn had first learned to track and kill for the government. The hanging closed the legal case, but arguments about justice began almost at once and have never completely stopped. Some contemporaries insisted that Horn had been framed to give the cattle barons a scapegoat, that others who had ordered and paid for killings escaped accountability by letting one hired gun carry the weight. Others pointed to the long list of dead men tied to his work and said that even if someone else had fired the shots at the Nickel Gate, Horn had earned the rope many times over. For the Nickel family, the trial and execution meant that someone with real power had finally been punished for what happened to their son. Beyond individual opinions, Horn's death marked a turning point in how the West handled private violence. Open hiring of range detectives who acted as executioners became harder to defend in public. Stockmen's associations still employed investigators, but they were more careful about how those men worked and how closely they could be tied to killings. Courts and voters in new Western states expected that disputes over land and stock would end in hearings, not in long-range rifle shots from behind brush. The image of Tom Horn standing on the Julian gallows, a man who had killed for law officers and cattle barons until the law itself condemned him, served as a clear warning. The frontier habit of answering every challenge with a bullet had reached a limit. From then on, anyone who chose to follow Horn's path did so, knowing that the same system that once paid for their skills could someday build the scaffold under their feet.